Long before emperors ruled from St. Petersburg, long before the Kremlin became the center of a vast state, and long before anyone could point to a map and find a country called Russia, there was only an enormous landscape of forests, rivers, marshes, and grasslands stretching across the eastern edge of Europe. There were no Russian borders. There was no Russian Empire. There was not even a single Russian people in the modern meaning of the word. Instead, there were communities scattered across distances so immense that traveling between them could take weeks. There were East Slavic tribes farming clearings in the forests. There were Finnic-speaking peoples living around the northern lakes and river systems. There were Baltic peoples farther west and beyond the forest belt, where the trees gradually surrendered to open grassland. There stretched the steppe, an enormous highway of migration, commerce, warfare, and conquest. For centuries, peoples came through that steppe from deep inside Eurasia. Some remained. Others disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. Yet the future of this region would not be determined by the land alone. It would be determined by water. Look at a map of Eastern Europe, and one feature becomes impossible to miss. Rivers run through it like enormous roads. The Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Western Двина, the Don, and countless tributaries connecting forests in the north with the Black Sea, the Caspian Basin, and lands far beyond. In an age when overland transportation was slow, expensive, and dangerous, these rivers offered something extraordinarily valuable: movement. A boat loaded with furs could travel farther than a wagon could reasonably hope to go. Merchants could follow waterways from the Baltic world toward the wealthy markets of Byzantium. Others could travel down the Volga toward the Caspian Sea and the Islamic world. And wherever merchants traveled, warriors followed. Sometimes the merchant and the warrior were the same man. During the 8th and 9th centuries, Scandinavian traders and fighting men increasingly entered these river systems. In the sources, they became associated with the name Varangians. Their precise role in the formation of early Rus became politically controversial many centuries later, because historians argued intensely about how much of the earliest state building came from Scandinavian elites and how much developed from existing Slavic society. Modern scholarship generally recognizes substantial Scandinavian participation without reducing the creation of Rus to a simple story in which outsiders arrived and created civilization from nothing. The reality was far more complicated. The emerging society was a mixture. Slavic populations formed much of its demographic foundation. Finnic and Baltic communities were part of the same commercial world. Scandinavian networks supplied merchants, warriors, and some early rulers. Steppe peoples influenced warfare, diplomacy, and commerce. Byzantium supplied religious and cultural models that would eventually transform everything. And from these encounters, something new began to emerge. Later tradition gave one moment special importance. The primary chronicle, compiled generations after the events it describes, tells of a Varangian prince named Rurik who was invited to rule in the north in 862. According to the chronicle, competing peoples had driven away Varangian rulers, attempted to govern themselves, descended into conflict, and eventually decided to seek a prince who could impose order. Rurik came and established his authority. It is a powerful founding story. It is also impossible to verify in all its details. Historians therefore treat the chronicle carefully. Rurik may well represent a historical Scandinavian leader, and a dynasty later claiming descent from him certainly became fundamental to the political history of Rus. But the neat story of an invitation in exactly 862 belongs partly to the realm of dynastic memory and medieval historical construction. What matters is that by the later 9th century, rulers associated with Scandinavian military networks had established themselves along the northern river routes, and their ambitions did not remain in the north. The greatest prize lay farther south. Kiev stood near the Dnieper. Its location was exceptional. From there, merchants could move toward the Black Sea and Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the richest cities on earth. To northerners who had spent their lives among wooden settlements and forest communities, Constantinople must have seemed almost beyond imagination. Its defensive walls towered over the approaches to the city. Its markets contained luxury goods from across the Mediterranean and Asia. Its churches glittered with precious materials. Its imperial court possessed a ceremonial grandeur designed specifically to overwhelm visitors with the majesty of Roman power. The people we call Byzantines did not call themselves Byzantines. They considered themselves Romans. Their empire was the surviving eastern continuation of the Roman imperial state. And to ambitious rulers developing along the Dnieper, relations with this empire offered wealth, legitimacy, and danger in equal measure. According to the traditional chronology, a ruler named Oleg seized Kiev in 882 and made it the center of an expanding political network. Whether every detail preserved by the chronicles is reliable is less important than the larger transformation they reflect. Power was moving toward Kiev. From there, the rulers of Rus could demand tribute from surrounding communities and participate in international trade. Furs traveled south. Wax and honey traveled south. Slaves also traveled south, a grim but important part of the medieval economy. Silver, silk, wine, weapons, jewelry, and other valuable goods traveled in the opposite direction. The route was lucrative. It was also brutal. Boats had to be dragged around dangerous rapids. Travelers risked attack from steppe peoples. Storms could destroy vessels. A merchant expedition could become a military campaign with very little warning. And the princes of Rus increasingly behaved not merely as traders, but as rulers capable of mobilizing armies. Rus forces attacked Constantinople more than once. At other times, Rus warriors served the Byzantine emperor. The relationship between the two worlds oscillated between commerce, diplomacy, military service, and war. But over time, Byzantine influence would achieve something Rus armies had never accomplished. It would conquer Rus culturally. Before that transformation, the ruling elite participated in a pagan religious world. The chronicles describe deities including Purin, associated with thunder and warfare. Vladimir, a prince who seized Kiev in the late 10th century after a violent struggle for power, initially appears in the chronicle as an enthusiastic supporter of pagan cults. He would become the ruler responsible for one of the most consequential decisions in the history of Eastern Europe. Vladimir had reasons to seek something greater than a collection of local cults. His realm was expanding. Different peoples inhabited it. Trade connected it with powerful monotheistic civilizations. And Christianity offered political advantages that were difficult to ignore. Western Europe was Christian. Byzantium was Christian. Bulgaria had embraced Christianity. A ruler admitted into this religious world could participate in networks of diplomacy and dynastic marriage unavailable to a pagan outsider. The primary chronicle later transformed Vladimir's choice into one of the great stories of medieval Rus. According to its famous account, representatives of different religions approached the prince. Islam was considered. Western Christianity was considered. Judaism was considered. Then Vladimir sent envoys abroad to investigate how different peoples worshipped. The envoys eventually reached Constantinople and attended an Orthodox liturgy. Overwhelmed by the beauty they witnessed, they returned with words that would echo through Russian historical memory. They said they no longer knew whether they had been in heaven or on earth. It is an unforgettable story. It is also almost certainly literary in important respects. Rulers did not usually choose religions by conducting something resembling a medieval comparative religion contest. Politics, diplomacy, marriage, military alliances, and existing Christian influence inside Rus offer much stronger explanations. The decisive events unfolded around 988. Vladimir accepted Byzantine Christianity and married Anna, sister of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, an extraordinary dynastic match for a ruler whom Constantinople might previously have regarded as a dangerous northern barbarian. Vladimir was baptized. The elite followed. The population of Kiev was ordered toward baptism. Pagan sanctuaries were attacked or abandoned, and Rus formally entered the Orthodox Christian world. The transformation was not instantaneous. One decree could not erase older beliefs across enormous territories. Pagan customs endured. Christian practices mixed with earlier traditions. Conversion proceeded unevenly over generations. But politically and culturally, the change was enormous. Rus now looked toward Constantinople for religious authority. Churches rose in places where wooden sanctuaries had stood. Clergy arrived. Monasteries developed. Religious texts circulated. Literacy acquired new institutional foundations. And through the broader Slavic Christian tradition, Church Slavonic and the Cyrillic writing system became central to religious and literary culture. This was not simply the adoption of a new religion. It was the beginning of a civilizational orientation that would survive invasions, dynastic collapse, revolutions, and centuries of political transformation. Eastern Christianity became embedded so deeply in the political culture of the region that rulers living hundreds of years after Vladimir would still derive legitimacy from the choice he had made. Yet Vladimir's realm was not Russia. It is important not to project modern nations backward onto the medieval past. Kievan Rus is part of the historical inheritance claimed especially by Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, and its political and cultural centers occupied territories now divided among several modern states. Calling it simply an early version of the later Russian Empire obscures more than it explains. The connection is real, but it is neither simple nor exclusive. The political system itself was also fundamentally different from the centralized monarchy that would eventually emerge in Moscow. Rus was a dynastic realm. Members of the ruling family governed different cities and territories. A senior prince might hold Kiev, but brothers, sons, nephews, and cousins ruled elsewhere. This could work when one prince possessed overwhelming authority. It became far more dangerous when succession was disputed. For a time, however, prosperity overshadowed the weakness. Under Vladimir's son Yaroslav, later remembered as Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus reached one of its great periods of political and cultural influence. Yaroslav's path to power was violent. After Vladimir's death in 1015, members of the ruling family fought for control. Several princes died. Yaroslav eventually secured Kiev and established himself as the dominant ruler. Once his position became secure, his reign demonstrated how closely Rus had become integrated into Christian Europe. Dynastic marriages connected his family to royal houses across the continent. His daughters married powerful rulers. One became Queen of France. His political network stretched far beyond the Dnieper. Inside his realm, law became an increasingly important tool of rule. The legal tradition, later known collectively as the Ruskaya Pravda, developed over time and reflected attempts to regulate property, violence, debt, social status, and compensation. Its world could still be harsh. Medieval justice was not modern justice. But written legal traditions represented an important stage in the institutional development of Rus. Kiev itself displayed the wealth of the age. Yaroslav sponsored St. Sophia Cathedral, whose mosaics and architecture proclaimed both Christianity and princely authority. Monasteries became centers of religious life. Books were copied. Clerics recorded history. Foreign merchants passed through the city. Visitors encountered a capital tied simultaneously to Northern Europe, the steppe, and Byzantium. For anyone standing in Kiev during its flourishing 11th century, the idea that political gravity would eventually move hundreds of kilometers northeast toward an obscure settlement called Moscow would have sounded extraordinary. Kiev was the great prize. Kiev was the symbolic heart, and that was precisely why the struggle to possess it became so destructive. The dynasty grew larger with every generation. More princes meant more claims. Territories were distributed and redistributed. A prince might move from one city to another according to complex rules of seniority and inheritance. Those rules could be interpreted differently by men with armies. The result was recurring conflict. This did not mean Rus suddenly collapsed after Yaroslav. Its fragmentation was gradual. Regional centers became more powerful. Novgorod developed distinctive political institutions and immense commercial importance in the north. Vladimir Suzdal rose in the northeast. Smolensk remained significant. Galicia and Volhynia became major powers in the southwest. Kiev retained enormous symbolic value, even when its ability to dominate these other centers weakened. Something important was happening. The old network was becoming a family of competing principalities. They shared religion. They shared dynastic connections. They shared elements of language and culture. But they did not share a centralized state capable of consistently compelling collective action. And the geography surrounding them offered no guarantee that they would be allowed to resolve these disputes peacefully. The steppe was always moving. Before the Mongols, Rus had already confronted successive nomadic powers. The Pecheneg had posed a major threat. Later came the Cumans, known in Rus sources as the Polovtsians. Relations were not simply hostile. Rus princes fought steppe peoples, traded with them, allied with them, and married into their elites. One Rus prince might recruit Cuman warriors against another Rus prince. Another might campaign against the Cumans. The political frontier was fluid. Then, in the early 13th century, disturbing reports came from farther east. An unfamiliar force had appeared. It had destroyed kingdoms across Central Asia. It moved with astonishing speed. Its horsemen could cover distances that seemed impossible. Its commanders coordinated separate armies across vast landscapes. and behind them stood a man whose conquests were remaking Eurasia. Temujin, known to history as Genghis Khan, had united rival groups on the Mongolian steppe and created a military-political system of extraordinary effectiveness. His army struck into northern China and Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire was shattered. Mongol commanders pursued enemies across thousands of kilometers. During one enormous reconnaissance and campaign through the Caucasus and steppe, Mongol forces approached the world of the Rus princes. The first great confrontation came in 1223, not 1237, as is sometimes mistakenly stated. In 1223, several Rus princes formed a coalition with Cuman allies and met the Mongols near the Khalkha River. The Mongol force was relatively limited compared with the invasion that would come later. Even so, the coalition failed catastrophically. Coordination among the Rus princes broke down. Different contingents moved separately. The Mongols exploited the disorder. A pursuit turned into slaughter. Several princes were captured and killed. Later chronicles preserved horrifying stories of Mongol commanders feasting over boards placed above captive princes being crushed to death beneath them. The details are difficult to establish with certainty. The message was not. A new military power had appeared, and the princes of Rus were dangerously unprepared to confront it. Then the Mongols disappeared. For more than a decade, the terrible encounter could almost be interpreted as a nightmare that had passed. It had not passed. The Mongols had greater campaigns elsewhere. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his descendants continued expanding the empire. The western lands were assigned within the enormous imperial system, and a new campaign was organized under Batu, a grandson of Genghis Khan. This time, the Mongols did not come as scouts. They came to conquer. In late 1237, Ryazan stood in their path. The city resisted. The consequences were devastating. Mongol siege warfare had been developed through campaigns against some of the most sophisticated fortified civilizations in Eurasia. They were not simply horse archers riding around walls. Their armies incorporated engineers, siege specialists, intelligence networks, disciplined command structures, and techniques borrowed from peoples they had conquered. Cities that assumed fortifications would save them discovered otherwise. Ryazan fell. Its destruction became legendary. Then the Mongols advanced deeper into the northeastern principalities. Kolomna fell. Moscow, still a relatively minor settlement, was burned. Vladimir, one of the principal centers of northeastern Rus, was attacked in 1238. Members of the ruling family took refuge in the cathedral. The city was overwhelmed. Fire consumed buildings. The ruling household suffered catastrophic losses. An army attempting to resist the invaders was defeated. The Mongols continued. For reasons historians still debate, Novgorod escaped direct destruction. Season, terrain, logistical concerns, and changing strategic priorities may all have contributed. But the invasion was far from finished. After operations in the steppe and surrounding regions, Badu's armies turned toward the southwest. In 1240, Kiev faced the catastrophe. The city's political importance had declined from its peak, but its symbolic significance remained immense. Mongol forces demanded submission. Kiev resisted. Siege engines hammered the defenses. The walls were breached. Fighting moved through the city. The defenders made their final stands around fortified positions and churches. When it was over, Kiev was devastated. Later descriptions emphasized death on a horrifying scale. The exact population losses cannot be known with precision, and medieval accounts often magnified destruction rhetorically. But archaeology and written evidence leave no doubt that the conquest inflicted enormous damage. The city that had baptized Vladimir, the city of Yaroslav, the city whose rulers had married into European dynasties. The old political center of Rus had been broken, and the Mongols did not stop there. Their armies moved west into Poland and Hungary. European rulers suddenly confronted an enemy whose military methods they scarcely understood. In 1241, Mongol forces defeated European armies at Legnica and Mohi. Then, as abruptly as the invasion had expanded, circumstances changed. The death of Great Khan Ogidi contributed to a strategic withdrawal of leading Mongol princes toward the east, although historians caution against reducing the withdrawal to this single explanation. Western Europe escapait permanent Mongol occupation. Much of Rus did not. The political order that emerged under Badu became known eventually as the Golden Horde. Its center lay in the lower Volga region. From there, the Khans exercised supremacy over many Rus principalities. This relationship is often described in older histories as the Tatar yoke. The phrase captures the reality of subordination and tribute, but can also oversimplify a complicated system that changed over time. The Khans did not normally replace every Rus prince with Mongol governors. Direct occupation of every forest principality would have been unnecessarily expensive. Instead, the Mongol rulers generally allowed local dynasties to remain in place provided that they acknowledged the Khan, obeyed political demands, and delivered tribute. For the princes, survival now required a new kind of political skill. A man could possess a hereditary claim and still find that claim worthless unless the Khan confirmed him. Rus princes traveled to the horde. They competed for charters of authority, commonly associated with the term Yarlik. They brought gifts. They negotiated. They denounced rivals. Some died during these encounters. Others returned strengthened by Mongol support. The struggle for supremacy among the Rus princes had not ended. It had acquired a terrifying new judge. And this created one of the great paradoxes in the development of Moscow. The city that would eventually present itself as the liberator of the Rus land from steppe domination first rose partly because its rulers became exceptionally effective at operating within the political world created by the horde. Moscow was not initially the obvious candidate for leadership. Tver was powerful. Vladimir possessed old prestige. Novgorod was rich. Other principalities had stronger traditions. Moscow's beginnings were comparatively modest. Its name appears in a chronicle under the year 1147, associated with Prince Yuri Dolgoruki. Its geographical position, however, proved useful. It lay among interconnected river systems. Forests provided some protection. It occupied a region capable of attracting migration from areas exposed to steppe raids. And perhaps most importantly, Moscow acquired a dynasty whose princes proved remarkably persistent. One of the earliest figures associated with Moscow's separate princely line was Danil, a younger son of Alexander Nevsky. Alexander himself occupied an extraordinarily important place in later Russian memory. In the 13th century, while the Mongols dominated from the east, Catholic military powers threatened parts of the northwest. Alexander, Prince of Novgorod and later Grand Prince, became famous for victories against Western enemies, including the Swedes of the Neva in 1240 and forces of the Teutonic Order and their allies at the Battle on the Ice in 1242. Later memory transformed him into a defender of orthodoxy and the Russian lands. Yet his policy toward the Mongols was accommodation rather than heroic rebellion. That contrast mattered. Alexander resisted where he believed resistance possible. Toward the horde, he generally accepted Mongol supremacy. This was not necessarily cowardice. The Mongols had demonstrated what happened to cities that attempted resistance without sufficient strength. Preservation sometimes required submission. His descendants in Moscow would perfect that calculation. Daniil's small principality expanded gradually. His successors acquired neighboring territories by inheritance, purchase, political maneuver, and force. But the ruler who made Moscow impossible to dismiss was Ivan I. History remembers him as Ivan Khalida. The nickname is commonly rendered as Moneybag. It suited both his reputation and his methods. Ivan became Prince of Moscow in the early 14th century. At this time, Moscow and Tver were engaged in an increasingly serious rivalry. Both wanted influence over the prestigious title associated with the Grand Principality of Vladimir, and both understood that the horde could decide who obtained it. Then Tver made a disastrous mistake. In 1327, an uprising erupted there against Mongol representatives. The violence threatened the horde's authority. Ivan aligned himself with a Mongol response. For Moscow's later patriotic mythology, this could be an uncomfortable episode. The city that would eventually claim leadership in resistance to the horde benefited directly from helping punish another Rus principality for rebellion. But history rarely arranges itself according to later national myths. Ivan's choice was politically effective. Tver was weakened. Moscow's standing with the Khan improved. Ivan received expanded authority and became involved in collecting tribute. Money flowed through Moscow. Some continued toward the horde. Some strengthened Ivan's own position. Territory could be purchased. Loyalty could be rewarded. Competitors could be pressured. While other rulers gambled on open confrontation, Ivan accumulated resources. He also understood that political power was not enough. A city needed sacred authority. The Orthodox Church had survived the Mongol conquest in a peculiar position. It suffered from the destruction around it. But Mongol rulers were often willing to grant religious institutions privileges so long as political loyalty was maintained. The church, meanwhile, offered something no prince could manufacture easily: continuity. Dynasties fought. Cities burned. Khans changed. But orthodoxy connected the fragmented Rus lands to the world of Vladimir's baptism and to a shared sacred history. The Metropolitan, the leading hierarch of the Rus Church, increasingly associated himself with Moscow during Ivan's era. Metropolitan Peter spent his final years there and was buried there. His successor made Moscow a principal center of ecclesiastical administration. This gave Moscow something greater than another fortress or another source of tribute. It gave the city a claim to be the spiritual heart of Rus. Stone churches appeared. Relics accumulated. Monasteries and clergy reinforced princely legitimacy. A political partnership was forming between Moscow's ruling dynasty and the Orthodox hierarchy. It would eventually become one of the foundations of Russian autocracy. Yet Moscow still served the horde. Tributes still traveled south and east. Princes still required recognition. The Khan still possessed the power to intervene. No intelligent ruler in the 14th century could simply pretend otherwise. But the horde itself was changing. The unified Mongol Empire had fragmented. Within the Golden Horde, dynastic struggles became increasingly intense. Rival claimants competed for power. Military commanders acquired independent influence. The political instability created opportunities for ambitious Rus princes. And in Moscow, one prince decided that an opportunity had finally arrived. His name was Dmitry Ivanovich. History would remember him as Dmitry Donskoy. Dmitry became prince while still young. His reign unfolded amid complicated contests involving Moscow, Tver, Lithuania, and factions within the Horde. The struggle was not a simple national war of Russians against Mongols. Political alliances crossed ethnic and religious lines. Rus princes could cooperate with steppe leaders. Lithuania controlled large populations descended from the old Rus world. Mongol factions fought one another. Everything depended on who could gather allies at the right moment. One powerful figure in the Horde was Mamai. Mamai was not himself a Khan descended from Genghis Khan, which limited his legitimacy in the Mongol political tradition. Instead, he wielded enormous influence behind nominal Khans. Dmitry's resistance to Mamai eventually brought their forces toward a confrontation that later Russian memory would elevate to almost sacred status. In 1380, Dmitry gathered forces from Moscow and allied Rus territories. Before the campaign, later tradition associated him with Sergius of Radenez, one of the most revered monastic figures in Russian Orthodox history. Accounts of Sergius blessing Dmitry and of warrior monks joining the battle became fundamental to the religious memory of the event, though historians debate aspects of how later sources embellished the story. Dmitry crossed the Don. This was a dangerous decision. By placing the river behind his army, he made retreat more difficult. He was committing himself to battle. The armies met at Kulikovo Field. The fighting was savage. Medieval battles could dissolve rapidly once formations broke. Dust, noise, close combat, cavalry charges, and confusion made command extraordinarily difficult. According to later narratives, Dmitry exchanged his princely clothing and fought among his soldiers. A reserve force hidden from immediate view eventually struck at a critical moment. Mamai's army collapsed. The battlefield belonged to Dmitry. It was a remarkable victory, but its meaning needs to be understood carefully. Kulikovo did not end Mongol supremacy. It did not create an independent Russian state overnight. It did not remove tribute permanently. Only 2 years later, in 1382, Khan Tokhtamysh attacked Moscow. Through deception and force, the city was taken and burned. Its inhabitants were slaughtered or carried away. Dmitry was compelled to recognize the Horde's supremacy again. Measured only in immediate political results, Kulikovo could therefore appear strangely incomplete. But historical importance is not measured only by what happens the following year. Kulikovo demonstrated that a large army organized around Moscow could defeat a major steppe force in open battle. It enhanced Moscow's prestige among the Rus principalities, and generations of chroniclers turned the victory into proof that resistance was possible. Mamai had lost. Moscow had survived. Dmitry acquired the name Donskoy of the Don. Something had changed, even if political independence still lay nearly a century away. During that century, the map of Eastern Europe became even more complex. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania expanded across enormous territories that had once belonged to Kievan Rus. Lithuanian rulers governed many Orthodox East Slavic populations. To Moscow's west and southwest stood a rival political world with its own plausible claim to gather former Rus lands. This is crucial to understanding Moscow's later expansion. There was nothing inevitable about all East Slavic territories eventually falling under Moscow. Alternative centers of political consolidation existed. Novgorod offered another alternative. It was unlike Moscow in important ways. Novgorod was wealthy, commercially connected to the Baltic, associated with the Hanseatic trading world, and governed through institutions that gave powerful local elites and assemblies a greater role than Moscow's increasingly princely system allowed. Its famous Vesh assembly became a symbol of Novgorodian political tradition. The city controlled enormous northern territories rich in fur. Its merchants looked outward. Its political culture was proud. And from Moscow's perspective, all of this made Novgorod both valuable and dangerous. The decisive phase arrived under Ivan III. Ivan came to power in 1462. By then, Moscow was no longer a small principality seeking the Khan's favor. It was the most formidable political center in northeastern Rus. Ivan intended to make that superiority permanent. He expanded with patience when patience worked and violence when violence worked better. He brought rival principalities under Moscow's authority. He reduced the independence of powerful families. He increasingly presented himself as sovereign over a broader Rus inheritance. Novgorod could not escape forever. Its political leaders were divided over how to respond to Moscow's growing power. Some looked toward Lithuania as a counterweight. To Ivan, that created both a threat and a justification for intervention. Moscow framed the struggle not merely as politics, but in religious terms, suggesting that Novgorod's connections with Catholic Lithuania threatened orthodoxy. In 1471, Muscovite forces defeated Novgorod at the Battle of the Shilon River. Novgorod survived, but its independence had been critically weakened. Ivan waited. Then he returned. In 1478, Novgorod was incorporated into Moscow's state. Its political autonomy was dismantled. The Vesh bell, the great symbol later associated with the city's self-government, was removed. Leading families lost lands or were displaced. Moscow gained Novgorod's enormous territorial holdings. The consequences were immense. Ivan had not simply captured another city. He had eliminated one of the strongest alternative political traditions in the Rus world. The future state developing around Moscow would not be a federation of autonomous commercial republics. Its direction was becoming unmistakably centralized. Then came the confrontation with the Horde. By the late 15th century, the Golden Horde had fragmented substantially. Successor khanates had emerged. Crimea was increasingly independent and aligned at times with Moscow against other steppe rivals. The political landscape that had terrified Rus princes in the 13th century no longer existed in the same form. Ivan III had grown strong enough to challenge tribute demands. In 1480, forces associated with Moscow and Khan Akhmet of the Great Horde approached one another along the Ugar River. For weeks, the armies faced each other. The river separated them. There were skirmishes and attempts to find crossings. Both leaders understood the risk of a decisive battle. Akhmet hoped for assistance that did not arrive as expected. Ivan balanced military preparations against fears of catastrophe. Then conditions worsened. Winter approached. The strategic situation shifted. Akhmet withdrew. No Kulikovo-style climactic battle decided the confrontation. There was no single enormous cavalry charge, no dramatic duel, no final storming of a fortress. And yet the outcome became one of the great dividing lines in Russian history. The horde's capacity to impose political supremacy on Moscow had effectively ended. The relationship established after Bada's conquest had finally broken. 2.5 centuries after the first Mongol armies had smashed the Rus coalition at the Khalkha River, Moscow stood independent of the authority that had once confirmed its princes. But independence did not make Ivan III gentler. If anything, the disappearance of an external overlord allowed Moscow to accelerate the concentration of authority at home. Ivan adopted increasingly elevated political language. Documents and court ceremony presented him as sovereign. The title Tsar, derived ultimately from Caesar, appeared in certain contexts, although Ivan IV would later become the first Muscovite ruler formally crowned as Tsar in 1547. Ivan III's marriage added another layer of symbolism. In 1472, he married Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI. Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The event shocked the Orthodox world. The city that had sent Christianity northward in Vladimir's age was now ruled by a Muslim dynasty. Sophia's marriage did not legally transfer the Byzantine Empire to Moscow. There was no universally recognized imperial succession in which she simply handed the Roman crown to her husband. But symbolism does not require tidy constitutional law to become powerful. At Moscow's court, Byzantine ceremonial influences grew. The double-headed eagle, already a symbol with a complex history, became associated with Muscovite sovereignty. And among churchmen, there gradually emerged a far greater idea. If ancient Rome had fallen away from true faith in Orthodox interpretation, and if Constantinople, the Second Rome, had fallen to the Ottomans, then perhaps Moscow possessed a providential destiny. In the early 16th century, the monk Philippii would formulate the concept in famous language addressed to the ruler. 2 Romes had fallen, the third stood, and there would be no fourth. The doctrine later called Moscow, the Third Rome, should not be treated as though it instantly became a detailed government program embraced by everyone. Its later importance has sometimes been projected backward, but the idea captured something genuinely transformative. Moscow's ruler was no longer merely trying to become the strongest prince among relatives. His court was developing a universal language of sacred sovereignty. The ruler defended orthodoxy. The dynasty gathered the lands of Rus. The state stood independent of the horde, and the fall of Byzantium allowed Moscow to imagine itself as an Orthodox center with responsibilities extending far beyond its original forests. Architecture reinforced the transformation. Ivan rebuilt the Kremlin. He employed Italian architects, a striking reminder that Muscovy's supposedly isolated culture was capable of selectively importing expertise from Renaissance Europe. New stone walls rose. Cathedrals took shape. The Kremlin became not merely a fortress, but a physical expression of centralized monarchy. Visitors approaching Moscow increasingly encountered a court determined to appear equal to the great sovereignties beyond its borders. Ivan also confronted the boyars, the hereditary aristocratic elite whose wealth and family networks could challenge central authority. He did not abolish them. He needed their military and administrative service. But the political direction was clear. Nobles would serve the sovereign. They would not constitute an independent constitutional body capable of sharing sovereignty on equal terms. Land, service, office, and proximity to the ruler became increasingly intertwined. The legal system reflected the same centralizing impulse. The Sedebnik of 1497 attempted to standardize legal procedures across Ivans in large territories. Among its many provisions were restrictions connected to peasant mobility around the autumn feast of St. George. These restrictions did not yet constitute the fully developed serfdom of later centuries, but they formed part of the long process through which peasant movement would become increasingly constrained. The state was becoming stronger. The freedom of many ordinary people was not necessarily becoming greater with it. That contradiction would appear again and again in Russian history. Expansion strengthened the monarchy. Reform strengthened the monarchy. Military modernization strengthened the monarchy. Even liberation, centuries later, would often be designed from above to preserve the state. Ivan III died in 1505. He left his successors a realm vastly larger and politically more ambitious than the Moscow he had inherited. His son Vasily III continued the consolidation. Pskov lost its autonomy in 1510. Smolensk was taken from Lithuania in 1514. Ryazan was absorbed. More rival centers disappeared. One court increasingly dominated. But dynastic power always contained one vulnerability that no army could eliminate. The ruler could die, and his heir could be a child. Vasily III died in 1533. His son Ivan was only 3 years old. The boy inherited grand claims, great territories, sacred symbolism, and a court filled with men who knew that whoever controlled the child could control the state. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, governed as regent. She pursued meaningful administrative policies, including monetary reform. Then, in 1538, she died unexpectedly. Later rumors accused her enemies of poisoning her, though the evidence cannot establish the cause with certainty. The child Ivan was left in a court dominated by competing aristocratic clans. Later accounts, including Ivan's own recollections, portrayed these years as humiliating and frightening. Powerful boyars fought around him. He claimed to have experienced neglect and disrespect. Whether every memory should be accepted literally is impossible to know. Adults explaining their later behavior often reshape childhood into a story that makes the present seem inevitable. But Ivan unquestionably grew up amid factional conflict, and he developed an extreme conception of sovereignty. A ruler, in his mind, could not merely negotiate among aristocratic interests. He had to stand above them. No rival could be permitted to forget who commanded. As the boy grew older, observers encountered an intelligence that was both formidable and unsettling. Ivan read widely by the standards of his environment. He absorbed religious texts and chronicles. He understood the language of sacred kingship. He possessed a powerful memory and an ability to argue his position at length. He could display intense piety. He could also display terrifying violence. These traits were not separate chapters of his personality. They existed together. And in January 1547, when Ivan was 16 years old, the political transformation that had been developing for generations entered a new stage. Inside Moscow's Dormition Cathedral, Ivan underwent an elaborate coronation. Sacred objects surrounded him. The church blessed his authority. The ceremony connected monarchy with divine order, and Ivan did something his predecessors had not done in quite the same formal way. He was crowned Tsar of all Rus. The title mattered. Moscow's ruler was no longer presenting himself merely as Grand Prince. Tsar carried echoes of the Roman and Byzantine emperors and, in another political context, of the supreme rulers of the steppe. It placed Ivan above ordinary princes. It expressed sovereignty. It suggested a ruler whose authority did not depend on negotiation with equals. The boy who had watched nobles compete around him was now announcing that there were no political equals around him. But the coronation did not instantly give him complete control, nor did it immediately reveal what kind of ruler he would become. In fact, the first phase of Ivan's reign would contain reforms, military innovations, consultation, legal restructuring, and extraordinary territorial victories. For a time, it could appear that Moscow had found exactly the ruler its generations of expansion had prepared it to receive. Then the victories would become harder. The wars would lengthen. The people closest to Ivan would die or abandon him. Suspicion would begin to consume the court. And eventually, the Tsar would divide his own country in two and unleash against part of it an organization answerable to him alone. Before that terror came conquest, and Ivan's first great target lay on the Volga. The centuries-old struggle between the forest principalities of Rus and the successor states of the Mongol world had not ended with the stand on the Ugra. The Golden Horde had fragmented, but powerful khanates remained. One of them was Kazan. Kazan sat on the Volga and commanded a strategically vital region containing Muslim Tatars and numerous other peoples. Relations between Moscow and Kazan alternated between diplomacy, factional interference, raids, alliances, and war. For Ivan, control of Kazan promised security. It promised territory. It promised command of the Volga. And because Kazan was Muslim, Moscow could also describe the campaign through the language of Christian holy warfare. Earlier expeditions failed to settle the problem. Ivan prepared on a greater scale. A fortress was constructed at Sviazk as a forward base. Supplies moved toward the front. Artillery would play a central role. The Muscovite state had learned that expansion depended not merely on cavalry and courage, but on logistics, engineering, firearms, and the capacity to sustain an army far from Moscow. In 1552, Ivan marched against Kazan. The siege became one of the defining military operations of his early reign. Russian forces surrounded the city. Artillery battered fortifications. Engineers undermined defensive works. Explosions tore openings through positions that had resisted earlier attacks. The defenders fought fiercely. Then the final assault began. Russian troops entered Kazan. Fighting spread through the city. The Khanate's capital fell. For Moscow, the victory was monumental. It was celebrated in religious terms. Church bells rang. Processions gave thanks. The conquest seemed to prove that the sacred claims surrounding the Tsar had been vindicated by victory. The famous cathedral, now called St. Basil's on Red Square, was constructed during the following years to commemorate Ivan's victories associated with Kazan. But from a perspective of those conquered, the event looked very different. Kazan was not an empty frontier waiting for Russia to arrive. It was the center of an existing political society. Conquest brought deaths, displacement, new systems of landholding, religious pressure, and the extension of Muscovite authority over Muslim and non-Russian populations. This was an empire taking shape, even though the formal title Russian Empire would not be adopted until Peter the Great in 1721. And Kazan was only the beginning. In 1556, Astrakhan was brought under Muscovite control. The lower Volga opened toward the Caspian Sea. Moscow now commanded an enormous river corridor. The geopolitical consequences were difficult to exaggerate. The state that had once paid tribute to the descendants of Mongol conquerors was absorbing successor states born from the same imperial world. But conquest also transformed Moscow internally. Its subjects were becoming more diverse. Muslims lived under an Orthodox czar. Finnic and Turkic peoples entered the expanding realm in larger numbers. Government could not simply erase every local institution. Moscow therefore developed varying combinations of coercion, accommodation, conversion, elite cooperation, taxation, and military pressure. There was no single imperial policy applied uniformly everywhere. Local conditions mattered. Loyal elites could be incorporated. Communities could retain aspects of their religious or cultural life. At other moments, pressure could become severe. The empire would repeatedly discover that conquering territory and governing populations were entirely different tasks. Ivan was victorious, young, sacredly crowned, master of Kazan, master of Astrakhan, ruler of a state expanding toward the Caspian and already looking farther east. Had his reign ended at that point, his historical reputation would be radically different. But Ivan did not intend to stop on the Volga. He looked west. There lay the Baltic. And beyond the Baltic lay a commercial and technological world from which Moscow wanted greater access. Ivan wanted ports. He wanted trade. He wanted a route toward Europe that hostile states could not easily close. In 1558, Russian armies entered Livonia. At first, everything seemed to confirm Ivan's confidence. Fortresses fell. The old Livonian order struggled. Russian forces advanced. Then the conflict changed. What began as an attack on a weakening regional power drew stronger states into the contest. Lithuania became deeply involved. Poland and Lithuania moved toward an even closer political union, eventually creating the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Sweden intervened. Denmark had interests in the region. The war became international, and Moscow discovered that victories against Kazan did not guarantee victories against the military and political powers of northeastern Europe. Years passed. The war consumed money. It consumed men. Armies moved through territories already damaged by violence. Fortunes shifted, and at the center of the state, Ivan's personal world began to darken. In 1560, his wife Anastasia Romanovna died. Ivan had been deeply attached to her. He became convinced that she had been poisoned. Modern investigation has not resolved the question decisively. Some testing of remains has found elevated levels of substances that generated renewed debate, but such evidence cannot straightforwardly establish deliberate poisoning. For Ivan, certainty did not require proof. He believed enemies surrounded him. Many he had trusted fell from favor. One of the most famous was Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a military commander who defected to Lithuania in 1564. Kurbsky then exchanged bitter letters with Ivan. Their correspondence became one of the most remarkable political documents of the age. Kurbsky accused Ivan of tyranny. Ivan defended the Tsar's right to punish traitors. Behind their personal hatred stood a fundamental argument. Did aristocratic elites possess rights against the ruler? Or did every subject, regardless of rank, exist ultimately at the sovereign's pleasure? Ivan's answer was uncompromising. Then, at the end of 1564, he did something extraordinary. The Tsar left Moscow. He took treasury, religious objects, and members of his household with him. From Alexandrovskaya, Sloboda, he sent messages back to the capital. He accused boyars, officials, and clergy of betrayal. He announced that he had relinquished rule because treason made proper government impossible. Moscow panicked. The political theater was brilliant and terrifying. Ivan knew that many people feared a power vacuum more than they feared him. Delegations begged him to return. He agreed. But there was a condition. The Tsar would be allowed to establish a domain in which he could punish supposed traitors without ordinary restraints. In 1565, the Oprichnina began, and the centralized state built patiently by Moscow's princes was about to reveal how frightening centralized power could become when the ruler decided that suspicion itself was evidence. The Oprichnina did not begin with one massacre. It began with a division. Ivan IV took a portion of his realm and separated it from the ordinary machinery of government. This territory became the Oprichnina, a personal domain placed under the Tsar's direct authority. The remainder of the country was generally called the Zemshchina and continued to be administered through more conventional institutions. On paper, this could sound like an administrative rearrangement. In reality, Ivan was creating an extraordinary instrument of personal power. He selected men who owed their position directly to him. They became known as oprichniki. Some came from relatively modest service families. Others belonged to established elites, but understood that survival now depended on demonstrating unquestioning loyalty. Ivan could use them against precisely those aristocratic networks he distrusted. Their historical image became almost theatrical. Contemporaries and later writers described them dressed in black. The famous story that they rode with a dog's head and a broom attached to their saddles, symbolizing a determination to sniff out treason and sweep it away, became inseparable from their legend. Exactly how literally and universally these symbols were used is disputed, but the symbolism captures the mentality of the institution. The Tsar had defined treason so broadly that almost anyone could become guilty of it. Land was confiscated. Families were displaced. Estates were redistributed. Men once secure in inherited wealth discovered that property meant little if Ivan decided their loyalty was doubtful. Executions followed. Punishment could extend beyond the alleged offender to relatives, servants, dependents, and entire communities. Fear itself became an administrative tool. Ivan was trying to destroy alternative concentrations of power. But terror has a problem. Once a government rewards people for discovering enemies, its servants have an incentive to keep discovering them. A system designed to identify actual conspiracies can begin manufacturing conspiracies simply to justify its own existence. And Ivan's Russia was already under pressure. The Livonian War continued. Enemy armies threatened the western frontier. Crimean Tatar raids remained a grave danger from the south. Harvest failures and epidemics struck communities. Landholders struggled to maintain estates as peasants fled taxation, warfare, and insecurity. The Tsar's response to weakness was often to demand still greater control. Then suspicion fell upon Novgorod. The city had already lost its political independence under Ivan III nearly a century earlier. Yet it retained a distinctive identity, wealth, commercial connections, and memories of its older traditions. Ivan IV became convinced that leading Novgorodians were preparing to betray him, perhaps by transferring allegiance to the Polish-Lithuanian world. Whether a serious conspiracy actually existed on the scale Ivan imagined is extremely doubtful. That did not save the city. In the winter of 1569 to 1570, Ivan and the Oprichniki moved toward Novgorod. The campaign became one of the darkest events of his reign. People suspected of disloyalty were arrested. Clergy were targeted. Property was plundered. Monasteries and churches were stripped of wealth. Executions occurred on a large scale. Some accounts describe victims being drowned in the Fokov River. Others describe torture, mutilation, and families destroyed together. Later chronicles sometimes give enormous casualty figures that historians consider unreliable. The exact number of dead remains uncertain, but the uncertainty should not disguise the event itself. Novgorod suffered a major campaign of state violence ordered by the Tsar. The destruction extended beyond direct killing. Food stores and property were seized. The economic life of the surrounding region was damaged. A city that had once embodied one of the strongest alternatives to Muscovite centralization was subjected to the ruler's wrath long after its independence had vanished. Ivan then turned toward Pskov. Tradition tells a strange story about a holy man confronting the Tsar there and warning him against further bloodshed. Whatever the precise truth behind later legends, Pskov escaped destruction on the scale inflicted upon Novgorod. But the terror had revealed something essential about Ivan's system. The Oprichnina could devastate subjects. Could it defend Russia? In 1571, an answer came from the south. Crimean Khan Devlet Giri led a major invasion. The Crimean Khanate was not a minor remnant awaiting absorption. Protected by its relationship with the Ottoman Empire and possessing formidable cavalry forces, Crimea remained one of Muscovy's most dangerous enemies. Its raiding networks penetrated far into the borderlands, capturing people for enslavement and inflicting serious economic damage. In 1571, Crimean forces reached Moscow. Much of the city was built of wood. Fire spread catastrophically. Moscow burned. Thousands died. Others were carried away. The supposedly fearsome machinery Ivan had created to secure the realm had failed to prevent an enemy from reaching its capital. The following year, the Crimeans returned. This time, Russian forces under Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky met them near Melody. The battle was decisive. Despite facing a dangerous invasion force, the Muscovite army achieved a major victory. Had the battle ended differently, the consequences for Ivan's state might have been catastrophic. Instead, the southern threat was temporarily checked. That same period saw the formal end of the Oprichnina as a separate institution. In 1572, Ivan abolished it. The word itself became dangerous to mention, but abolishing an institution did not undo what it had accomplished. Aristocratic property had been disrupted. Families had been ruined. Regions had been depopulated. The economy had suffered, and a political precedent had been established. The sovereign could identify internal enemies, remove ordinary restraints, and create exceptional structures of punishment in the name of defending the state. Still, Ivan's problems were not over. The Livonian War continued to turn against him. The creation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569 had produced a formidable Western rival. Under King Stephen Bathory, The Commonwealth launched successful campaigns against Muscovy. Sweden took advantage of Russia's difficulties as well. Ivan's armies, once triumphant in Livonia, were forced backward. The war that had begun in 1558 as an attempt to secure Baltic access ended after a quarter century without delivering the prize. Russia lost its major conquests in Livonia. Its economy had been strained. Its western frontier had been battered. An entire generation had experienced war. There was, however, another frontier where events were moving in Moscow's favor. East of the Urals lay Siberia. The word suggested not one empty wilderness, but an enormous collection of environments and societies. Forests stretched across distances almost impossible to comprehend. Great rivers flowed north toward the Arctic. Indigenous peoples lived by hunting, fishing, herding, agriculture in some regions, and complex networks of trade. The Khanate of Sibir controlled part of western Siberia. Russian merchants had become increasingly interested in the wealth beyond the Urals, especially fur. Fur was not a minor luxury. In the early modern world, high-quality pelts could be extraordinarily valuable. Sable in particular could enrich merchants and fill state treasuries. The Stroganov family, merchants granted substantial privileges along Russia's eastern frontier, became deeply involved in expansion. They employed armed men, including Cossacks. Among their leaders was Yermak Timofeyevich. Yermak's expedition into Siberia, beginning around 1581 or 1582, became legendary. The force was small compared with the armies Ivan had sent against Kazan, but it possessed firearms and experience. It fought the forces of Khan Kukum. At the Battle of Chuvash Cape in 1582, Yermak's men defeated Kukum's army and soon occupied Kashlik, the Khanate's capital. The conquest was far from complete. Kukum remained dangerous. Yermak himself was killed a few years later, traditionally said to have drowned during a surprise attack. The early Russian position could easily have collapsed. Instead, Moscow sent reinforcements. Forts followed. Settlers followed. Tax collectors followed. Clergy followed. And what had started as a risky frontier expedition became the opening movement of one of the largest territorial expansions in history. Ivan would not live to see its full scale. By the early 1580s, he was aging in a court haunted by death. His first wife was long gone. His marriages, after Anastasia, had not restored the stability of his earlier household. His health appears to have deteriorated. His moods remained volatile. Then came the most notorious personal tragedy associated with his reign. According to widely accepted historical tradition, in November 1581, Ivan quarreled violently with his eldest surviving son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. Exactly what provoked the confrontation is uncertain. Different accounts offer different explanations. One says the Tsar became enraged over the clothing of his pregnant daughter-in-law. Another places the quarrel within political and military disagreements. During the confrontation, Ivan struck his son with his staff. The younger Ivan suffered a grave injury and died several days later. The scene later inspired one of the most famous paintings in Russian art. Ilya Repin's image of an old Ivan clutching his dying son in horror, his eyes seemingly realizing in a single instant what rage had destroyed. The painting was created centuries later. It is not a photograph of what happened, and some details of the prince's death have been disputed. But contemporaneous and near contemporary testimony strongly supports the conclusion that Ivan's violence caused his son's fatal injury. If so, the act was not only a family catastrophe, it was a dynastic one. The son Ivan killed was considered capable of succeeding him. The heir who remained was Fyodor. Fyodor was deeply religious and apparently uninterested in the brutal political competition required to govern Muscovy. Ivan had spent a lifetime trying to make the Tsar's authority overwhelming. In a moment of rage, he may have destroyed the man best positioned to exercise it after him. Ivan IV died in March 1584. He was 53. Behind him lay one of the most contradictory reigns in Russian history. Russia was larger than it had been at his coronation. Kazan and Astrakhan were under Moscow's rule. Expansion beyond the Urals had begun. Central institutions had developed. Military and administrative reforms from the earlier reign had mattered. Printing had reached Moscow. Diplomatic and commercial contacts with England and other European states had increased. But the achievements had come beside extraordinary destruction. The Livonian War had failed. The Oprichnina had devastated important regions. The population had endured warfare, raids, epidemics, and economic disruption. Peasant flight was becoming an increasingly serious concern to landowners and the state, and the dynasty itself was dangerously fragile. Fyodor, I became Tsar. Nominally, the crown remained securely in Rurikid hands. In practice, one man became increasingly indispensable. His name was Boris Godunov. Boris came from a service family that rose within Ivan's political world. His sister Irina had married Fyodor. That made Boris the Tsar's brother-in-law. Fyodor's limited interest in government created space for Boris to become the dominant political figure at court. Later enemies portrayed him as an unscrupulous schemer. Supporters saw an intelligent statesman who provided stability after Ivan's destructive final decades. Both images would shape his reputation. Under Fyodor, Russia did not simply disintegrate. The government recovered some lost territory from Sweden after renewed conflict. The Patriarchate of Moscow was established in 1589, elevating the head of the Russian Orthodox Church from metropolitan to patriarch. This strengthened Moscow's ecclesiastical prestige and its claim to stand as one of the major centers of Orthodox Christianity. Cities and fortifications were developed on vulnerable frontiers. Siberian expansion continued. Tyumen was founded in 1586. Tobolsk followed in 1587. These were not merely settlements. They were points from which an expanding state could project taxation, military authority, trade, and colonization into enormous territories. Yet at the center of the dynasty lay a problem that became more dangerous each year. Fyodor had no surviving child. Ivan IV had left another son, Dmitri, born to his final wife, Maria Nagaya. The young boy lived with his mother in Uglich. In 1591, Dmitri died there from a throat wound. The circumstances became explosive. An official investigation concluded that the child had injured himself during an epileptic seizure while holding a knife. Opponents of Boris Godunov later claimed that Boris had arranged the murder to clear his path to the throne. The accusation was politically devastating. Proof was another matter. Historians have debated Dmitri's death for centuries, and no decisive evidence demonstrates that Boris ordered his murder. But once a dynasty entered crisis, rumor could become stronger than documentation, and the dead child would return, not literally, but politically. Fyodor died in January 1598. With him, the ruling line descending from the old Rurikid dynasty that had shaped Rus and Muscovy for centuries came to an end. Russia faced a question that hereditary monarchy is designed to avoid. Who rules when inheritance gives no clear answer? The Zemsky Sobor, an assembly including representatives of important social and institutional groups, selected Boris Godunov. Boris accepted the crown. He was a competent ruler, but competence could not manufacture dynastic legitimacy. Some of the great boyar families looked at him and saw not the descendant of ancient princes, but a man who had risen through court politics. The Romanovs were among the families that could resent his dominance. So were others. Boris understood the danger and acted against potential rivals. Members of the Romanov family were forced into exile or religious life. One of them, Fyodor Nikitic Romanov, was compelled to become a monk under the name Filaret. That humiliation would matter later. For the moment, Boris ruled. Then the weather changed. Beginning in 1601, Russia suffered catastrophic harvest failures. The causes lay far beyond Boris's control. The great eruption of Huayna Purina in Peru in 1600 contributed to global climatic disruption, and unusually cold conditions affected harvests across parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Russia experienced a devastating famine from 1601 to 1603. Crops failed. Grain prices soared. People abandoned villages. Some traveled toward Moscow, hoping to find food. Boris attempted relief. The government distributed grain and money. Public works were organized. But no early modern government possessed the logistical capacity to solve a disaster on such a scale. People starved. Disease followed hunger. Contemporary reports contain horrifying descriptions. Families disintegrated. Corpses lay unburied. Stories of cannibalism circulated. Population losses were enormous, though precise figures are impossible to establish. The political consequences were equally severe. In a sacred monarchy, catastrophe could become evidence against the ruler. If the harvest failed year after year, perhaps God had withdrawn favor. If the Tsar lacked legitimate blood, perhaps the entire realm was being punished. And somewhere beyond Russia's western border, a man appeared who offered an explanation so dramatic that desperate people were prepared to believe it. He claimed to be Dmitri, Ivan IV's supposedly dead son. The story was extraordinary. According to the pretender, the child in Uglich had not really been the Tsarevich. The true Dmitri had escaped an assassination plot and survived in secret. Now, as an adult, he had returned to reclaim his father's throne. Historians call him False Dmitrii. His actual identity remains debated, though he has often been identified with a former monk named Grigory Otrepiev. What matters is that his claim found an audience. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, powerful individuals saw opportunity. Some Polish nobles backed him. He converted to Catholicism privately and developed relationships with Catholic patrons. He became engaged to Marina Nisik, daughter of a Polish noble. King Sigismund III did not simply launch the entire Commonwealth into war on Dmitri's behalf, but influential subjects were willing to assist the adventure. In 1604, the pretender crossed into Russia with a relatively small force. Had Boris governed a stable society, the invasion might have ended quickly. Russia was not stable. Peasants had suffered famine. Cossacks resented central authority. Displaced men wandered the southern frontier. Boyar factions hated one another. The identity of the claimant almost became secondary. He represented a possibility. Towns defected. Cossacks joined him. Soldiers changed allegiance. Government forces fought back. and at points the pretender's situation became precarious. Then, in April 1605, Boris Godunov suddenly died. His son Fyodor Borisovich became Tsar. The young ruler was intelligent, educated, and catastrophically unlucky. He inherited a throne at the exact moment loyalty was collapsing. Commanders defected to Dmitry. Moscow turned against the Godunov family. Fyodor II and his mother were murdered. Their deaths cleared the road. False Dmitry entered Moscow in triumph. The man who may once have been an obscure monk now sat on the throne of Ivan the Terrible. For a moment, it seemed almost miraculous. Maria Nagaya, mother of the real Dmitry, publicly recognized the pretender as her son. Whether she believed this, acted under pressure, or simply chose survival cannot be known with confidence. Dmitry attempted to consolidate his rule. He was energetic. He was less attached to old court customs than many Muscovites expected. He brought Polish associates into his circle. He prepared to marry Marina Nisik, and that marriage accelerated the reaction against him. Marina entered Moscow surrounded by Polish attendants. She remained Catholic. To conservative Orthodox observers, the spectacle fed fears that foreigners and Catholics were gaining influence inside the sacred capital. Political opponents needed little more. Prince Vasily Shuaysky, who had already maneuvered through the Godunov and Dmitry crises, joined a conspiracy. In May 1606, less than a year after Dmitry's triumphal entry, Moscow erupted. Conspirators attacked the Kremlin. Dmitry attempted to escape. He was killed. His body was exposed and abused. Later accounts say it was burned, the ashes loaded into a cannon, and fired back toward Poland. Whether every theatrical detail occurred exactly as later retold, the message of the assassination was unmistakable. The miracle had ended, and instead of restoring order, Dmitry's death removed one of the last restraints on complete political breakdown. Vasily Shuaysky became Tsar Vasily IV. His claim was weak. He belonged to the old princely aristocracy and could trace his ancestry to the Rurikid dynasty, but ancestry alone no longer commanded obedience. The country was fragmenting. A massive rebellion led by Ivan Bolotnikov erupted. Bolotnikov's movement brought together an unstable coalition including Cossacks, lower status servicemen, peasants, and opponents of Shuaysky. It threatened Moscow before eventually being defeated. Then another Dmitry appeared. False Dmitry II established a rival court at Tichino, near Moscow. The situation became almost surreal. Russia had a czar in Moscow. A pretender had another court nearby. Boyars moved between them. Officials sometimes attempted to protect themselves by maintaining relationships with both. Marina Nisik, widow of false Dmitry I, eventually recognized false Dmitry II as her supposedly surviving husband. The political fiction was almost impossible to believe. Yet belief was not always required. A pretender could serve as a flag around which armed interests gathered. The term time of troubles does not fully communicate what ordinary people experienced. This was dynastic collapse, civil war, social rebellion, foreign intervention, famine, banditry, competing governments, and repeated military occupation. The Russian state that Ivan III and Ivan IV had centralized now appeared capable of disappearing altogether. Shuaysky, desperate for military assistance, turned to Sweden. That brought the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth more openly into the conflict. King Sigismund III invaded Russia in 1609. His forces besieged Smolensk. In 1610, a Polish-Lithuanian army under Hetman Stanislav Zalkiewski defeated Russian and Allied forces at the Battle of Kloshino. The consequences were immediate. Shuaisky was overthrown. A group of leading boyars took authority in Moscow. They agreed, under conditions, to recognize Sigismund's son the Ladislaw as Tsar. Polish troops entered Moscow, but negotiations over the Ladislaw's accession became entangled in the greater ambitions of his father, religious questions, and Russian distrust. The arrangement that might theoretically have produced a negotiated monarchy instead became occupation. Russia had reached its lowest point. The legitimate dynasty was gone. Successive tsars had fallen. Pretenders multiplied. Foreign troops controlled the Kremlin. Sweden occupied territory in the northwest. Smolensk fell to the Poles in 1611 after a long siege. Different regions obeyed different authorities. For contemporaries, this could look less like a temporary crisis than the end of the Russian state. Yet the occupation also created something the earlier dynastic quarrels had lacked: a common enemy. Patriarch Hermogenes became an important voice calling for resistance. He was imprisoned and died in captivity, but appeals associated with the defense of orthodoxy helped mobilize opposition. An initial militia formed but fractured amid internal divisions. Then, in Nizhny Novgorod, a second movement gathered. At its center was not a czar, not a great conqueror, not even initially one of the most powerful aristocrats. Kuzma Minin was a merchant and local civic figure. He called upon the community to contribute money and resources to build an army capable of liberating Moscow. People were asked to sacrifice heavily. The movement needed a military commander. It selected Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, who had been wounded in earlier fighting and possessed a reputation for ability and integrity. The partnership became legendary. Minin represented mobilization and civic sacrifice. Pozharsky represented military leadership. Their militia gathered forces in Yaroslavl and gradually built a provisional political structure. The campaign was not simply an eruption of spontaneous patriotism. It required money, organization, food, negotiation among competing factions, military discipline, and a shared argument that the Russian land and Orthodox faith had to be rescued from foreign domination and domestic collapse. In 1612, the militia advanced toward Moscow. Polish forces inside the Kremlin faced shortages. A relief army under Hetman Jan Karol Chodkiewicz attempted to break through. Fighting around Moscow was intense. Pozharsky's forces, supported by Cossacks and other contingents, prevented the relief effort from saving the garrison. The trapped troops inside the Kremlin began to starve. Conditions became horrific. Finally, in October 1612, according to the old Russian calendar, the Polish garrison capitulated. Moscow had been recovered. The Kremlin was back in Russian hands. But liberation solved only half the problem. Russia still had no universally accepted ruler. If the factions simply resumed fighting over the crown, the cycle could begin again. A new assembly was called. The Zemsky Sobor of 1613 had to choose someone who possessed enough legitimacy to be accepted, but not so much independent power that rival elites would immediately fear domination. Several candidates were possible. Foreign princes were considered. Russian aristocrats had claims. Then attention settled on a teenager, Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. He was 16. His family had connections to the old ruling dynasty. His great-aunt Anastasia Romanovna had been Ivan IV's first and beloved wife. His father was Filaret, the Romanov whom Boris Godunov had forced into monastic life and who was now in Polish captivity. The family's suffering during the Troubles could be portrayed as evidence that it had not caused the catastrophe. Mikhail's youth was an advantage as much as a weakness. Different factions could imagine influencing him. According to later patriotic tradition, representatives found Mikhail at the Ipitiv monastery near Kostroma and informed him that he had been chosen. His mother resisted, fearing that the throne that had destroyed so many men would destroy her son. The delegation persisted. Mikhail accepted. In 1613, he became Tsar. No one standing at his coronation could know that his descendants would rule until 1917. The Romanov dynasty began not in overwhelming triumph, but in exhaustion. That is essential. The first Romanov did not inherit the confident state of Peter the Great or Catherine II. He inherited wreckage. Fields had been abandoned. Villages had vanished. Trade routes had been disrupted. Population had fallen severely in affected areas. Foreign enemies still held Russian territory. Government authority outside the center was inconsistent. The new dynasty's first achievement would therefore not be spectacular conquest. It would be survival. Peace came gradually. Sweden remained a threat. The war ended with the Treaty of Stalbovo in 1617. Russia recovered Novgorod, but surrendered territories that blocked direct access to the Baltic. That loss would matter enormously. Nearly a century later, Peter the Great would fight Sweden in part to reverse the strategic position created during this period. The conflict with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth continued longer. The Truce of Delino was concluded in 1618. Russia lost Smolensk and other Western territories. Again, the settlement was painful. Again, peace mattered more than pride. The state needed time. Mikhail's father Filaret returned from captivity in 1619. He became Patriarch of Moscow. For the next years, father and son effectively shared power, with Filaret exercising enormous political influence. The arrangement strengthened both dynasty and church. Taxes were reconstructed. Administrative offices resumed work. Military forces were reorganized. The government attempted to determine who lived where, what land people possessed, and what obligations they owed. That may sound less dramatic than conquest, but states are built from records as much as from battles. A treasury cannot function without knowing whom to tax. An army cannot function without knowing whom to recruit. Land grants mean little without records showing ownership. Courts cannot impose authority if local communities can simply ignore orders. The Romanov restoration was therefore bureaucratic as well as dynastic. The old prikazy, specialized government offices continued and expanded. One handled foreign affairs. Another dealt with military service. Others administered specific territories or categories of state business. The system could be confusing and overlapping. It was far from a modern bureaucracy, yet it allowed Moscow to project instructions farther across its territories than a medieval princely household could have done. The government also confronted a problem that would shape Russian society for centuries. Peasants were moving. Some had fled during the time of troubles. Others escaped landlords because frontier regions promised freedom. Landowners depended upon peasant labor. Service nobles, in turn, depended upon estate income to equip themselves for military service. If peasants could simply leave an estate whenever conditions became intolerable, the landholding structure on which the military state depended could weaken. So the state increasingly restricted peasant mobility. This process had begun before the Romanovs. It now intensified. Runaway peasants became the subject of searches and legal claims. Landlords demanded longer periods in which fugitives could be recovered. What was emerging was a social order in which millions of agricultural workers would be bound more firmly to land and landlord precisely while the Russian state itself was expanding across continents. The contradiction was striking. Russia's geographic frontier became one of the largest spaces of movement on Earth. At the same time, the legal freedom of many people in its agricultural heartland narrowed. Mikhail died in 1645. His son Alexei Mihailovich inherited a state far more stable than the one his father had received. Alexei became known by the epithet Tshetshe, often translated as the quietest or most quiet. The title should not mislead. His reign was not quiet. It witnessed legal transformation, urban rebellion, religious schism, war with Poland, Cossack upheaval, and further territorial expansion. In 1648, Moscow itself erupted. The immediate issue involved taxation and corruption. A salt tax had angered the population. Officials associated with the government were hated. Crowds demanded redress. Violence broke out in what became known as the Salt Riot. Houses burned. Officials were attacked. The uprising terrified the government. Other towns experienced unrest. The message was obvious. The rebuilt monarchy was stronger than it had been during the Troubles, but taxation and administrative abuse could still provoke explosive resistance. The response included one of the most important legal documents of pre-Petrine Russia. In 1649, the government promulgated the Sobornoye Yelazny, a comprehensive law code. It attempted to systematize a huge range of legal relationships: criminal law, property, state service, religion, social status, the authority of the czar, and, crucially, the position of peasants. The code abolished time limits on recovering runaway serfs. A landlord's claim did not simply expire after a number of years. Flight could be pursued indefinitely. This was a decisive stage in the consolidation of Russian serfdom. It is important to understand what serfdom was and what it was not. A serf was not legally identical to a chattel slave in every respect. Serfs existed within households, communities, and legal arrangements and could possess certain customary or practical rights. But their freedom was profoundly constrained. Landlords could exert extensive authority over their labor and lives. Movement was restricted. Families could be separated in some circumstances. Later practices allowed serfs to be sold in ways that often approached the realities of human property. The system became one of the central moral, social, and economic problems of Imperial Russia. And it was not an accidental leftover from distant antiquity. The state actively helped construct and enforce it. Why? Because the monarchy needed the service nobility. The service nobility needed labor and income. The tax system needed populations that could be located. So the freedom of peasants became entangled with the military and fiscal requirements of centralized government. The empire's later rulers would repeatedly discover that dismantling serfdom meant disturbing the entire structure on which their state had been built. While the center tightened its hold on peasants, the frontier offered escape. Some fugitives traveled south toward the Cossack communities of the Don. Others moved east. Cossack societies occupied a complicated position between state service and frontier independence. They could defend borders. They could raid enemies. They could serve in imperial armies. They could also shelter fugitives and lead rebellions. Moscow needed them and feared them simultaneously. One frontier, above all, seemed limitless: Siberia. After Yermak's expedition, Russian expansion accelerated with astonishing speed. The basic mechanism was often simple. A group of Cossacks or servicemen moved along a river. They built an ostrog, a wooden fort. From a fort, officials demanded yasak, usually fur tribute from indigenous populations. Fur traveled west. Information about the next river traveled east. Then another expedition departed. Diab opened one route. The Yenisei opened another. The Lena led still farther. Tobolsk became an administrative center. Tomsk was founded in 1604. Yenisei followed in 1619. Krasnoyarsk in 1628. Yakutsk in 1632. These names formed a chain across a continent. The speed is difficult to grasp. Moscow lies thousands of kilometers from the Pacific. There were no railways, no paved transcontinental roads. Winter temperatures could kill an unprepared traveler within hours. Rivers froze. Mountain ranges blocked routes. Supplies had to cross extraordinary distances. And yet by 1639, Russians had reached the shores of the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific Basin, a state whose political ancestors had once clustered around river routes between the Baltic and Black Seas, now touched the world's largest ocean. The expansion is sometimes described as exploration. It was exploration. It was also colonization and conquest. Indigenous communities did not simply volunteer to become tributaries of Moscow. Some cooperated for strategic or commercial reasons. Some resisted. Some attempted to play rival Russian detachments against one another. Some were subjected to hostage-taking, known in various contexts through the taking of amanats, intended to guarantee tribute. Violence could be severe. Russian forces possessed firearms that provided advantages, but local peoples knew the terrain. Resistance sometimes lasted for decades. Disease also traveled with newcomers. Small indigenous populations could be devastated by epidemics. The empire moving eastward, therefore, contained the same mixture that characterized many early modern imperial expansions elsewhere: trade and coercion, migration and dispossession, missionary activity and cultural exchange, private profit and state power. The fur tribute became enormously valuable. Sable was sometimes described metaphorically as Siberian gold. Pelts could be sold into European and Asian markets. The state treasury benefited. Merchants benefited. Officials frequently found ways to benefit personally. The hunt moved farther east partly because intensive extraction depleted animal populations in established areas. The frontier, therefore, pulled itself onward. Beyond Siberia stood China. Russian expansion eventually encountered the Qing Empire in the Amur region. This introduced a limit the Russians had not confronted while advancing through more decentralized territories. The Qing state could deploy substantial military power. Clashes occurred around settlements, such as Albazin. Neither empire could simply ignore the other. In 1689, Russia and Qing China concluded the Treaty of Nerchinsk. It was the first major formal treaty between the two states. Russia accepted limits on its position in the Amur Basin. In return, a framework for relations and commerce emerged. This mattered because Russian expansion had reached a point where geography alone no longer determined how far Moscow could move. Another large, centralized empire stood in the way. But decades before Nerchinsk, events far closer to Moscow were tearing Russian religious life apart. The conflict began with something that might appear trivial to an outsider. How should a Christian make the sign of the cross? With 2 fingers? Or 3? How many times should Hallelujah be sung? How should the name of Jesus be spelled in church books? Should processions move in one direction or another? To modern observers, such disagreements can seem too small to divide a civilization. To 17th century believers, they were not small. Ritual expressed truth. If worship had been handed down by holy ancestors, changing a gesture could mean corrupting the faith itself. Patriarch Nikon believed Russian Orthodox service books and rituals had diverged from contemporary Greek practice through generations of copying and local development. He wanted correction. Beginning in the 1650s, reforms standardized Russian practice more closely with Greek models. 3 fingers replaced 2 in making the sign of the cross. Texts were altered. Ritual details changed. Nikon possessed enormous confidence. For a time, he also possessed extraordinary influence over Tsar Alexei. Resistance formed almost immediately. Opponents argued that the old Russian rites were not errors. They were sacred inheritance. If anything, some believed the Greeks had deviated from true orthodoxy after centuries of political catastrophe and foreign influence. Among the most famous opponents was Archpriest Avakakam. His autobiography later became one of the great works of early Russian literature. Avakakam was fierce, uncompromising, and prepared to suffer. He rejected Nikon's reforms. The state punished him. Exile did not silence him. Imprisonment did not silence him. Threats did not silence him. The dispute became a schism. Those who maintained the older rituals became known as Old Believers. The government and official church persecuted them. Communities fled toward remote frontiers. Some hid in northern forests. Others moved east into Siberia. Some groups, facing arrest and convinced that the state had fallen under Antichrist-like corruption, embraced mass self-immolation. Entire communities died in fires of their own, making rather than submit. Avakakam himself was eventually burned in 1682. Nikon did not triumph personally. His own ambitions brought him into conflict with Alexei. Nikon had an exalted conception of patriarchal authority. The Tsar would not tolerate a church leader behaving as an independent sovereign. Nikon left Moscow in protest and was ultimately deposed by a church council in 1666 to 1667. But the same council upheld his ritual reforms. The paradox was complete. Nikon lost. Nikon's reforms survived. The Old Believers were condemned, and the monarchy emerged stronger in relation to the church. The conflict demonstrated where ultimate political authority lay. The Tsar could revere orthodoxy while refusing to share sovereignty with its patriarch. This process would reach its final institutional form under Peter the Great, who would eventually abolish the patriarchate itself for 2 centuries. Before Peter, however, Alexei had another immense problem and opportunity to the southwest. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth governed large populations of Orthodox East Slavs and territories that include much of modern Ukraine and Belarus. The steppe frontier along the Dnieper was home to Zaporozhian Cossacks. Their relationship with the Commonwealth was unstable. Cossacks demanded recognition, privileges, and protection of Orthodox interests. Polish nobles sought greater control. Peasants faced heavy burdens. Religious tensions intensified political conflict. In 1648, Bohdan Khmelnytsky led an enormous Cossack uprising against Commonwealth rule. The rebellion exploded across Ukrainian lands. Polish armies suffered severe defeats. Social violence became extreme. Landlords and officials were attacked. Jewish communities, many of whose members served as estate administrators, leaseholders, or lived in towns associated with the Commonwealth's economic system, suffered horrific massacres. The Khmelnytsky uprising remains central to several national histories, and those histories remember it very differently. For some Ukrainian traditions, it became a war of Cossack liberation. For Polish memory, it was a devastating rebellion against the Commonwealth. For Jewish history, it was a catastrophe associated with mass killing. For Moscow, it became an opportunity. Khmelnytsky needed a powerful protector. He had already negotiated with Crimean Tatars and other powers, but alliances were unstable. He turned increasingly towards Tsar Alexei. In 1654, at Pereyaslav, the Cossack leadership entered an agreement acknowledging the Tsar's authority. What exactly the agreement meant became the subject of centuries of dispute. Moscow interpreted it increasingly as submission to the Russian sovereign. Cossack elites often understood their status in terms of negotiated rights and substantial autonomy. Modern political narratives have repeatedly tried to turn Pereyaslav into a simple story of either eternal reunification or straightforward annexation. Neither formulation captures the complicated 17th century arrangement. What is clear is that the agreement brought Moscow into a major war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Russo-Polish War lasted for years. Moscow initially achieved dramatic successes. Smolensk, lost during the time of troubles, was recovered. Russian forces advanced into territories of present-day Belarus and Lithuania. Then the strategic picture became more complicated. Sweden invaded the Commonwealth in the conflict known as the Deluge. Alliances shifted. Cossack politics fragmented after Khmelnytsky's death in 1657. Ukraine entered a period of internal warfare and competing orientations, sometimes called the Ruin. Different hetmans looked toward Moscow, Warsaw, Crimea, or the Ottoman Empire. The struggle was not simply Russia against Poland over a passive territory. Local political actors pursued their own interests amid great power competition. By the Truce of Andrusovo in 1667, Moscow had gained significantly. Smolensk remained Russian. The lands of left bank Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, came under Moscow's authority. Kiev, despite lying west of the river, also passed to Moscow initially under arrangements that became permanent later. The symbolism was enormous. Kiev had been the great capital of medieval Rus. It was the city of Vladimir's baptism and Yaroslavl's cathedral. For centuries, Moscow's rulers had constructed a political identity around gathering the inheritance of Rus. Now Kiev itself stood under the Tsar. But the acquisition also changed Russia. Ukrainian and Belarusian Orthodox clerics brought educational traditions deeply influenced by the Polish-Lithuanian and broader European worlds. Kiev-Mohyla intellectual culture influenced Moscow. Western forms entered through Orthodox intermediaries. The state that later Peter would supposedly drag suddenly from medieval isolation into Europe was already experiencing substantial cultural exchange. Peter's revolution had predecessors. So did the rebellions that would haunt his dynasty. The most dangerous during Alexei's reign came from a Cossack named Stenka Razin. Stepan Razin emerged from the Don Cossack world. In the late 1660s, he led raiding expeditions down the Volga and into the Caspian. His men attacked Persian territories and returned with loot. His reputation grew. Then the movement changed from frontier raiding into major rebellion. In 1670, Razin led forces up the Volga. Towns fell. Discontented peasants, Cossacks, and non-Russian communities joined. The rebellion acquired an anti-elite character. Officials and landlords could be killed. Rumors promised liberation. Razin's proclamations exploited the familiar political idea that the good Tsar was surrounded by evil boyars and officials. That distinction was crucial in Russian popular politics. Rebels did not always reject monarchy. They might instead claim that they were fighting corrupt servants in the name of a true or just sovereign. Government forces eventually recovered. Razin was defeated, captured, and taken to Moscow. In 1671, he was publicly executed. The spectacle warned the empire that rebellion against the state would end brutally. But Razin's legend survived. Songs remembered him. Folklore transformed him, and the social conditions that had produced his movement remained. Serfdom still drove fugitives toward frontier communities. The state still required taxes. The frontier still offered armed men a degree of autonomy. Later, under Kievan the Great, another Cossack leader named Pugachev would ignite an even larger rebellion by claiming to be a dead emperor. The empire repeatedly generated its own rebels. Alexei died in 1676. The succession now passed into a complicated family structure. Alexei had children by two wives. His first wife, Maria Miloslavskaya, gave birth to sons including Fyodor and Ivan, and to the formidable daughter Sophia. His second wife, Natalia Naryshkina, was the mother of a boy named Peter. That division between the Miloslavsky and Naryshkin families would become dangerous. Fyodor III, Alexei's eldest surviving son from his first marriage, succeeded him. Fyodor was physically frail but intellectually capable. His short reign included significant changes. In 1682, the old system of precedence, known as местничество, was abolished. For generations, aristocratic families had argued over who possessed the right to command whom based on ancestry and previous offices held by relatives. The system could paralyze appointments. A capable man might refuse to serve under another noble because his family considered the command humiliating. Destroying местничество strengthened the crown's ability to assign officials according to service needs rather than purely genealogical rank. It was exactly the kind of reform later associated with Peter. Yet it happened before Peter ruled. Then Fyodor died in 1682 at only 20 years old. He left no surviving child. The court immediately confronted the rivalry between his brothers. Ivan was older, but he was in poor health and was regarded as incapable of vigorous rule. Peter was only 10, but physically energetic and the son of the Naryshkin faction. Peter's supporters moved quickly. The young boy was proclaimed Tsar. The Miloslavsky faction feared political destruction. Then Moscow's musketeer regiments entered the crisis. These were the Streltsy. Ivan the Terrible had created Streltsy units in the 16th century as firearm-equipped troops serving the state. Over the generations, they developed into a hereditary military community with families, economic interests, grievances, and political awareness. By 1682, many resented officers and feared changes to their status. Rumors spread that the Naryshkins had murdered Tsarevich Ivan. The rumor was false. Ivan was alive. But once armed regiments believed a royal murder had occurred, facts struggled to catch up. The Streltsy marched into the Kremlin. The 10-year-old Peter was there. What followed became one of the defining traumas of his childhood. Officials and members of the Naryshkin circle were seized. Some were thrown from palace stairways or balconies onto spears below. Others were hacked to death. Peter watched people close to his family die. One of the murdered men was Artemon Matveyev, an important associate of Peter's mother. Another victim was Natalia's brother Ivan Naryshkin, who was tortured and killed. The child could do nothing. He was supposedly an autocrat, but armed soldiers controlled the palace. A compromise followed. Ivan V and Peter I would rule jointly as co-tsars. A special double throne was constructed for them. Behind it, according to famous tradition, a hidden opening allowed advisors to prompt the young rulers during ceremonies. But neither boy actually governed. Their elder sister Sophia became regent. Sophia Alexeyevna was intelligent, ambitious, politically skilled, and unwilling to accept the secluded role traditionally expected of elite Muscovite women. Working closely with Prince Vasily Golitsyn, she effectively governed Russia for 7 years. Her regency challenged a simplistic narrative in which Russian political modernization began only when Peter pushed women into public court life. Sophia had already stood at the center of power. Golitsyn was an unusually sophisticated statesman. Russia under the Regency pursued diplomacy with European powers. In 1686, the eternal peace with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth confirmed major territorial arrangements, including Russian possession of Kiev. Russia joined the Holy League against the Ottoman Empire and Crimean Khanate. Golitsyn led campaigns against Crimea in 1687 and 1689. Both campaigns failed to produce decisive results. The steppe itself became an enemy. Crimean forces burned grass and denied supplies. Thousands of horses suffered. Logistics broke down. The failures damaged Sophia and Golitsyn politically. Meanwhile, Peter was growing. He spent much of his youth outside the formal center of government, especially at Preobrazhenskoye. This distance from conventional court life became enormously important. Peter formed groups of young companions to participate in military games. The games became more serious. Mock units evolved into disciplined formations. Eventually, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky Guards regiments emerged from this environment. They would become elite units of the Russian army and, ironically, later powerful players in imperial palace politics. Peter's interests were intensely practical. He liked fortifications, artillery, tools, mechanical devices, ships. Foreigners fascinated him. Near Moscow was the German quarter, a district associated broadly with foreign residents from various European backgrounds. The word German in Muscovite usage could apply more generally to foreigners from Western Europe. There Peter met officers, craftsmen, merchants, and specialists whose lives differed sharply from the ceremonial world of the Kremlin. Among those who entered his circle were Patrick Gordon, a Scottish soldier in Russian service, and Francois Lefort, a Genevan adventurer who became one of Peter's closest companions. Then there was a boat. It was an old English-style sailing boat discovered among stored possessions. For most people, it would have been an object of curiosity. For Peter, it became an obsession. Unlike traditional Russian river craft that depended heavily on currents, oars, or favorable directional movement, a properly rigged European sailing vessel could maneuver against the wind by tacking. Peter wanted to understand how. He learned. He sailed on lakes. He studied ship construction. The boy ruling an almost landlocked political culture began imagining fleets. But first he needed to rule his own court. By 1689, Peter was 17 and married to Eudoxia Lopakina. The marriage had been arranged in part to demonstrate that he had entered adulthood and was therefore capable of assuming political authority. Tensions between Peter's supporters and Sophia's government escalated. Rumors of an imminent attack circulated on both sides. Peter received reports that Streltsy might be coming for him. The memory of 1682 must have been immediate. He fled to the fortified Trinity Sergius Monastery. At first, this looked like weakness. Then powerful men began joining him. Military units declared loyalty. Patriarch Joachim sided with Peter. Foreign officers followed. Sophia discovered that authority was draining away from her. She attempted to rally support. It was not enough. Peter prevailed without a major civil war. Sophia was removed from government and confined to the Novodevichy convent. Golitsyn was exiled. Peter and Ivan remained co-tsars, but actual power shifted toward Peter's side of the family and their advisors. Yet Peter still did not immediately become the relentless reforming emperor of later legend. He was young. His mother and established officials handled much routine government. He devoted enormous time to military exercises, drinking parties, foreign companions, and ships. His personal behavior scandalized conservative observers. Peter and his companions formed a drinking society mockingly styled with parodies of ecclesiastical titles, later known as the all-joking, all-drunken synod. The rituals could be crude. For Peter, mockery of pomp and convention became part of a broader rejection of institutions he considered hypocritical or useless. But beneath the drinking and games, serious learning continued. Peter wanted a real navy. Russia's strategic geography frustrated him. The Baltic was blocked by Sweden. The Black Sea was constrained by the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. The White Sea offered access through Arkhangelsk, but it lay far north and could freeze for significant periods. A great state without reliable maritime access, Peter increasingly believed, was strategically crippled. He first looked south. The Ottoman fortress of Azov stood near the mouth of the Don. Capturing it could improve Russian access toward the Sea of Azov and potentially the Black Sea system. In 1695, Peter launched a campaign. The Russian army besieged Azov. It failed. The Ottomans could resupply the fortress by sea. Russia lacked sufficient naval power to stop them. Many rulers would have blamed commanders and moved on. Peter drew a technical conclusion. If the enemy could supply Azov from the water, Russia needed ships to close the water. He ordered a fleet built. The speed of the effort was extraordinary. Shipyards worked intensively, especially around Voronezh. Labor was mobilized. Foreign expertise was employed. Timber was cut. Vessels took shape. In 1696, Peter returned. This time, Russian naval forces helped blockade Azov. The fortress surrendered. It was Peter's first major military success, and it confirmed the lesson that would govern his life. Russia's weakness was not destiny. It was a technical problem. If the army was obsolete, rebuild the army. If there was no navy, construct one. If Russia lacked engineers, import them and train Russians. If nobles resisted service, compel them. If institutions failed, destroy and replace them. If society itself stood in the way, reshape society. That philosophy would make Peter one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history. It would also make his reforms extraordinarily coercive. He did not understand modernization as a process people needed to consent to. The state required something. Therefore, subjects would provide it. Labor. Taxes. Sons for the army. Timber for ships. Stone for cities. Beards, clothing, customs, and family lives could all become matters of government if Peter believed they affected the strength of the realm. But in 1696, that transformation still lay ahead. That same year, Ivan V died. Peter was now the sole czar. He had a fleet on the Don. He had captured Azov, but he knew that his experience remained narrow. He wanted allies against the Ottoman Empire. He also wanted knowledge. So he planned something extraordinary for a Russian sovereign. He would leave his empire, not for a border campaign, not for a nearby diplomatic ceremony. He would travel deep into Western Europe and see with his own eyes the shipyards, arsenals, workshops, courts, and cities that had produced the military power Russia needed to match. The expedition became known as the Grand Embassy. It departed in 1697. Its formal diplomatic goals included seeking support against the Ottoman Empire. Peter traveled nominally incognito under the name Pyotr Mikhailov. The disguise was absurd in one obvious respect. Peter was well over 2 meters tall. He was a sovereign surrounded by an enormous Russian diplomatic mission. European courts knew perfectly well who he was. The purpose of the fiction was not to make him genuinely invisible. It gave him room to behave unlike a ceremonial monarch. And Peter used that freedom. In the Dutch Republic, he went to shipyards. He handled tools. He watched craftsmen. He attempted to learn shipbuilding directly. At Zaandam, his presence quickly attracted crowds and made genuine anonymity impossible. He moved to Amsterdam, where the Dutch East India Company allowed him access to its facilities. He wanted practical knowledge, but he discovered something frustrating. Dutch shipbuilders often worked from accumulated experience rather than the sort of systematic theoretical plans Peter hoped to master. He heard that English shipbuilding used methods he found more suitable, so he went to England. There he inspected the Royal Navy. He visited shipyards at Deptford. He studied navigation. He examined factories and workshops. He visited scientific and technical institutions. He met specialists. He observed urban life. He even showed intense interest in anatomy and medicine. Peter's curiosity was almost predatory. He wanted to know how everything worked. Not only ships, states, armies, manufacturing, education, fortifications, social behavior. He hired foreigners for Russian service, officers, engineers, shipwrights, specialists who could carry knowledge east. But Peter's admiration for the West was selective. He did not travel through England and return convinced that Russia needed parliamentary sovereignty. He noticed technology more readily than constitutional restraint. He admired administrative effectiveness more than political liberty. This distinction would define his reforms. Peter intended to Europeanize the instruments of Russian power. He had no intention of making the Tsar less powerful. If anything, modernization would allow the ruler to reach deeper into society than the old Muscovite state ever had. The Grand Embassy continued into continental Europe. Then alarming news arrived from Moscow. The Streltsy had rebelled again. For Peter, this was not an ordinary military disturbance. The Streltsy were tied to his worst childhood memory. They were the men whose predecessors had stormed the Kremlin in 1682. They represented everything he despised about the old political order. Unreliable armed corporations, Muscovite traditionalism, factional intrigue, the shadow of Sofia. Peter abandoned much of the remaining journey and raced home. By the time he arrived in 1698, loyal forces had already defeated the rebellion. That did not satisfy him. He ordered an extensive investigation. Torture was used to extract testimony. Connections to Sofia were sought. Executions followed on a terrible scale. Hundreds of Streltsy were killed. Some were hanged near the convent where Sofia was confined, an unmistakable warning. Peter himself may have participated personally in executions, though details and foreign accounts require careful treatment. What is beyond dispute is that he endorsed the repression completely. The old Streltsy establishment was broken. Sofia was forced fully into monastic life. Peter had returned from European shipyards carrying new ideas. He also returned determined to destroy opposition. Then came one of the most famous scenes of his reign. At gatherings of nobles, Peter produced scissors or a razor. Beards came off. For Orthodox Muscovite men, the beard possessed cultural and even religious significance. Old images of holy men were bearded. Traditional masculinity was bearded. The face itself could express membership in an inherited social order. Peter looked at that same beard and saw backwardness. He demanded that elite men shave in Western style. Those allowed to retain beards under later regulations could be forced to pay a tax and carry a token proving payment. Clothing changed as well. Long traditional robes gave way under pressure to shorter European coats. Court customs altered. Women of elite families were increasingly brought into mixed social gatherings. The calendar was changed so that the year began on January 1st rather than September 1st. And the year numbering shifted from the old Byzantine creation era reckoning to the Christian era, though Russia retained the Julian calendar rather than adopting the Gregorian calendar used in much of Catholic and Protestant Europe. These acts were theatrical. Peter understood theater. Cutting a beard did not manufacture cannon. Changing a coat did not build a frigate. But symbols told the nobility that the state could enter even the realm of personal appearance. There would be no protected zone called tradition if Peter considered tradition an obstacle. Yet one great strategic question remained unresolved. Azov had given Russia a foothold in the south, but the Ottoman Empire and its allies still controlled the wider route toward the Black Sea. The Grand Embassy had failed to create the anti-Ottoman coalition Peter hoped for. Europe's diplomatic attention was shifting toward another crisis. The Spanish succession threatened continental war. Peter reconsidered. Perhaps Russia's great opening should not be south. Perhaps it should be northwest. On the Baltic stood Sweden. At the beginning of the 18th century, Sweden was no minor northern kingdom. It possessed a Baltic empire. Its territories surrounded much of the sea. Its army enjoyed a formidable reputation. Its institutions had supported decades of military power. And in 1697, the Swedish throne had passed to a 15-year-old king, Charles XII. Russia's neighbors looked at Charles and saw a boy. Denmark, Norway had grievances against Sweden. Augustus, too, ruler of Saxony and elected king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, wanted Swedish Livonia. Peter wanted access to the Baltic. They calculated that Sweden's young monarch could be overwhelmed. An anti-Swedish coalition formed. In 1700, the Great Northern War began. Peter believed he had spent years preparing Russia for modern warfare. He had foreign trained units, artillery, new officers, experience from Azov. He moved against the Swedish fortress of Narva. Then Charles XII arrived. The Russian army vastly outnumbered the Swedish force. The weather turned. Snow and wind obscured the battlefield. Charles attacked. Swedish troops smashed through Russian positions. Foreign officers surrendered. Units panicked. Bridges became death traps as men attempted to flee. Weapons and artillery were abandoned. Russia suffered a humiliating defeat. For Charles XII, Narva was a spectacular triumph. For European observers, it appeared to confirm every stereotype about Russia. The young Swedish king had broken a much larger army. Peter's modernization seemed exposed as a costume placed over weakness. The defeat could have ended his ambitions. Instead, it gave him the clearest lesson of his life. The reforms had not gone too far. They had not gone nearly far enough. Charles turned much of his attention toward Poland and Saxony, giving Russia time Peter had no right to expect. Peter used every year. The army was rebuilt. Conscription expanded. Artillery was replaced. Church bells were requisitioned in some places to provide bronze for cannon, an act that carried enormous symbolic weight even though bells were not the sole or necessarily primary material source for the rebuilt artillery. Factories expanded. Iron production increased. The Urals became increasingly important to military industry. Officers trained. Fortresses rose. Taxes multiplied. Everything served war. And while Charles XII pursued his enemies in the west, Peter returned to the Baltic frontier. Russian forces began taking Swedish positions around the Neva. In 1703, Peter captured territory where the Neva River reached the Gulf of Finland. The landscape was wet, marshy, flood-prone, cold. From a conventional perspective, it did not look like the obvious place to build one of Europe's great capitals. Peter saw something else. He saw the sea. On an island in the river delta, construction began on the Peter and Paul Fortress. Around it grew a settlement, then a city. St. Petersburg. There was no natural inevitability that the city would survive. Building conditions were punishing. Laborers were conscripted from across the empire. Men dug earth in mud and cold. Materials had to be transported across difficult terrain. Disease killed workers. Popular memory eventually claimed that enormous numbers died building the city, sometimes producing figures far beyond what evidence can verify. The exact death toll is uncertain. The coercion is not. Peter demanded a capital where he wanted one, and tens of thousands of subjects were mobilized over years to make his decision physical. Stone construction elsewhere was restricted at points, so skilled masons and building materials would be concentrated in the new city. Nobles were ordered to build houses there. Government institutions were moved. Foreign architects designed palaces and public buildings. Canals crossed the wet landscape. Shipyards rose. The city looked toward the Baltic rather than inward toward the old forests of Muscovy. Moscow had developed organically across centuries. St. Petersburg was an argument built in stone. Peter was saying that Russia's future faced Europe. But Charles XII was still alive. and Sweden had not accepted defeat. After years of campaigning in Poland, Charles turned east. His army invaded Russia. Peter had improved his forces, but he remembered Narva. He refused to give Charles the easy, decisive battle the Swedish king wanted. Russian forces withdrew. Supplies were removed or destroyed. The farther Charles advanced, the longer his lines became. The geography that had frustrated Russia's enemies for centuries began working against Sweden. Then Charles made a fateful decision. Rather than continue directly toward Moscow, he moved south toward Ukraine. There he expected assistance from Ivan Mazepa, hetman of the Cossack hetmanate. Mazepa had served the Russian crown for years. But Peter's increasing demands during wartime threatened Cossack autonomy. Mazepa chose to defect and ally with Charles. To Peter, the act was treason of the highest order. To later Ukrainian national narratives, Mazepa could become a figure resisting the destruction of autonomy. Again, imperial history looked different depending on where one stood. Mazepa's support did not materialize on the scale Charles needed. Russian forces under Alexander Menshikov destroyed Bactrin, a major Cossack stronghold associated with Mazepa, killing defenders and inhabitants in an episode whose precise casualty figures remain debated, but whose brutality is well established. The Zaporozhian Sich also became caught in retaliation. Charles's strategic situation deteriorated. Then came winter. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was exceptionally severe. Men froze. Horses died. Supply problems worsened. The Swedish army that emerged in the spring remained dangerous, but it was no longer the instrument that had stunned Europe at Narva. Charles besieged Poltava. Peter approached. On June 27th, 1709, under the Swedish calendar then in use, corresponding to July 8th in the Gregorian calendar, the two armies met. This was the battle Peter had spent 9 years preparing to fight. Swedish troops advanced against Russian defensive redoubts. Coordination broke down. Charles had been wounded shortly before the battle and had to be carried, limiting his ability to command directly. Russian artillery fired. Peter's infantry held. The Swedish attack lost cohesion. Then the Russian army moved forward. The force that Charles had humiliated at Narva no longer existed. In its place stood a reorganized army capable of meeting Sweden in open battle. Swedish formation collapsed. Thousands were killed or captured. The remnants fled south. At Perivalakna, a large portion of the surviving army surrendered. Charles escaped into Ottoman territory. Mazepa went with him and died later that year. Poltava changed the balance of northern Europe. Sweden was not instantly destroyed. The war would continue for more than another decade, but its aura of military invincibility had been broken. Russia was no longer the state humiliated at Narva. European courts had to reconsider what Peter was creating. Victory, however, brought Peter no inclination to relax. War had taught him that Russia's institutions needed permanent transformation. He reorganized provincial government to extract resources more efficiently. He demanded taxes that reached increasingly deeply into households and later individuals. He expanded manufacturing, often through state pressure and privileged private entrepreneurs. He required noble service. He sent young men abroad. He established schools. He wanted navigators, engineers, gunners, doctors, officials, people who could calculate rather than merely inherit status. The old boyar culture could not simply continue untouched. The state Peter was constructing needed a service elite. A nobleman's rank should depend, at least in principle, upon what he did for the sovereign. This logic would eventually produce the Table of Ranks in 1722. Military, civil, and court service would be organized into graded ranks. Birth remained enormously important in practice. Russia did not suddenly become a meritocracy, but the principle was unmistakable. The nobility existed to serve. Peter also turned toward the church. Patriarch Adrian died in 1700. Peter refused to allow the immediate election of another patriarch. He distrusted any office capable of becoming an independent center of authority. For 2 decades, the patriarchal throne remained effectively vacant. Eventually, Peter would replace it with the Holy Governing Synod, administered under state supervision. The church remained orthodox. Its rituals continued. Its monasteries remained influential. But institutionally, the monarch was pulling ecclesiastical government firmly into the administrative structure of the state. Nothing represented the personal cost of Peter's conception of sovereignty more painfully than his conflict with his own son. Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich was Peter's son by his first wife, Eudoxia Lopakina. Peter had grown estranged from Eudoxia and forced her into a convent. Alexei grew up associated in part with circles uncomfortable with his father's reforms. He was not the son Peter wanted. Peter demanded energy, military competence, service, and commitment to transformation. Alexei appeared reluctant, religiously conservative, and frightened of his father. As heir, that reluctance became political. Opponents of reform could imagine simply waiting. Peter would eventually die. Alexei would succeed him. Then perhaps the exhausting transformation could be reversed. Peter understood this. He demanded that Alexei either reform himself, renounce the throne, or enter monastic life. Alexei fled Russia in 1716. He sought refuge in Habsburg territory. This transformed a family conflict into an international political crisis. An heir to the Russian throne was now abroad beyond his father's control. Peter sent agents to recover him. Promises of forgiveness helped persuade Alexei to return in 1718. The promise did not protect him. Peter ordered an investigation. Alexei was interrogated. His associates were arrested. Torture was used. The authorities attempted to determine whether a wider conspiracy existed. Alexei was condemned to death. Before the sentence could be publicly carried out, he died in prison in June 1718 after interrogation and torture. Peter had effectively destroyed his own heir in the name of protecting the state he was building. The echo of Ivan IV was chilling. More than a century earlier, Ivan had fatally struck his son. Now Peter's son died after a judicial process driven by his father's determination to prevent succession from undoing reform. In both cases, the question of who would inherit became more dangerous because of the ruler's own actions. Yet Peter continued. He had no conception of private grief overriding public purpose. Or perhaps public purpose was how he escaped private grief. The war against Sweden moved toward conclusion. Russia had gained control of Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and strategic Baltic territories. Its navy had become a genuine force. St. Petersburg was increasingly secure. Sweden, exhausted after decades of conflict, could no longer reverse the transformation. Charles XII had returned from Ottoman territory and continued fighting until he was killed during a siege in Norway in 1718. The warrior king who had crushed Peter at Narva did not live to see the peace. Negotiations eventually produced the Treaty of Nystad in 1721. Sweden ceded Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and part of Karelia to Russia, while Russia returned some occupied territories and paid compensation under the settlement. The Great Northern War was over. 21 years had passed since Narva. Peter had begun the conflict as the ruler of a state Europeans often regarded as peripheral and militarily backward. He ended it in command of the dominant power in the Eastern Baltic. The Senate and church authorities bestowed new titles upon him. Peter accepted the style Emperor of all Russia. He also became known as Peter the Great. The Tsardom of Russia was now formally proclaimed an empire. The Russian Empire, in the strict political sense, had begun. But the Declaration of 1721 did not create an empire from nothing. The state had already ruled Tatars, Finnic peoples, Siberian indigenous communities, Cossack lands, and other non-Russian populations. It had been territorially imperial for generations. What changed now was the official language of sovereignty and Russia's position in the European state system. The title announced that Peter expected recognition not simply as a czar at the edge of Europe, but as an emperor among Europe's great monarchs. And St. Petersburg would be the stage on which that claim was displayed. The new capital rose in stone. Its avenues and palaces rejected the visual language of old Moscow. Ships entered the Neva. Foreign merchants arrived. The imperial court adopted European fashions. Women participated publicly in elite social life to a degree that would have startled previous generations. Assemblies brought noble men and women together for dancing and conversation. Peter ordered etiquette. He could order entertainment almost as aggressively as taxation. Yet behind the glitter stood an empire under immense pressure. The army required recruits. The navy required sailors. The city required labor. The bureaucracy required officials. Industry required workers. The treasury required money. Peter replaced older household taxation with a poll tax imposed on taxable males, increasing the state's ability to extract revenue. Censuses were conducted. People who might once have slipped between administrative categories were recorded. The state became more capable of counting subjects because counted subjects could be taxed. This was modernization in its Petrine form. Not the retreat of government, its expansion. A peasant village far from St. Petersburg might never see the emperor, but Peter's government could still reach it through a tax demand, a conscription order, a census, or a labor obligation. For ordinary Russians, becoming a great power could mean watching a son disappear into decades of military service. For nobles, it could mean compulsory attendance at court or lifelong state duty. For craftsmen, it could mean reassignment to a shipyard or factory. For old believers, it could mean additional burdens imposed upon a community already viewed with suspicion. The empire became stronger because society was forced to carry its weight. Peter believed the cost necessary. Not everyone agreed. There were rebellions and conspiracies. Resistance continued in frontier regions. The Bashkir population experienced repeated conflict with Russian authorities as settlement, taxation, religious policy, and administrative encroachment disrupted established life. The Astrakhan uprising of 1705 challenged the government. The Bulovin Rebellion beginning in 1707 erupted among Don Cossacks, partly in response to the state's efforts to recover runaway peasants. Kondraty Bulovin's movement spread dangerously before being crushed. Once again, Expansion of central control produced frontier resistance. Once again, the state won. The pattern was becoming deeply embedded. Russia could absorb extraordinary punishment because of its size and resources. Its rulers could mobilize people on a scale smaller states struggled to match. But every mobilization created resentment. Every victory strengthened the government that demanded the next sacrifice. Even Peter's cultural reforms had this dual character. He introduced a simplified civil script for secular printing. He encouraged publication. He promoted technical education. He supported scientific inquiry. He ordered the collection of curiosities and established the Kunstkamera. He planned an Academy of Sciences, formally founded shortly after his death. He encouraged Russians to learn mathematics and navigation because ships and artillery required mathematics and navigation. He was not an Enlightenment monarch in the later sense, but he believed ignorance was strategically dangerous. He wanted useful knowledge. A noble who could not calculate, map, command, or administer was less useful than one who could. The same Peter who could admire scientific instruments could personally beat subordinates. The same ruler who opened windows toward European learning imposed ferocious punishments. The same government that trained engineers strengthened serfdom rather than dismantling it. Russian modernization, therefore, did not follow a straight path from coercion toward freedom. Under Peter, coercion itself became modernized. By the 1720s, the emperor's body was beginning to fail. Years of exhausting travel, heavy drinking, harsh campaigning, and constant work had taken their toll. But he continued moving. He traveled, inspected, corrected, shouted, designed, punished, celebrated. The empire seemed incapable of keeping pace with the man who ruled it. In 1722, Peter changed the rules of succession. The memory of Alexei's betrayal, as Peter understood it, had convinced him that automatic inheritance could endanger everything he had built. So the emperor issued a decree allowing the reigning sovereign to designate a successor rather than simply following a fixed hereditary order. It was intended to protect stability. Instead, because Peter failed to make an unambiguous final designation before death, it helped create decades of uncertainty. This would become one of the great ironies of his reign. A ruler obsessed with institutional control would leave the single most important political question unresolved. Before that final crisis, Peter sought one more expansion. He turned south toward Persia. The Safavid Persian state was weakening. Peter launched the Persian campaign of 1722 to 1723, seeking influence along the Caspian and control of strategic territories. Russian forces occupied positions along the western and southern Caspian coast. Some of these gains would later be relinquished. The campaign showed that Peter's strategic imagination had become continental. Baltic, Black Sea, Caspian, Caucasus, Central Asia, Siberia, Pacific. Russia was no longer expanding along one frontier. It was beginning to think simultaneously in several directions. Then, according to a famous but probably embellished story, Peter saw soldiers or sailors endangered in icy water near the Gulf of Finland and personally entered the freezing water to help. Later illness was attributed to this heroic exposure. The reality of his final sickness was more complicated. Peter had suffered urinary and bladder problems, probably severe for some time. By late 1724 and early 1725, His condition deteriorated dramatically. Pain incapacitated a man who had built his identity around constant movement. Doctors could do little. At moments, he seemed to recover. Then fever and complications returned. The court understood what was approaching, and immediately, the unresolved question of succession became terrifying. Peter had surviving daughters. His wife Catherine had been crowned empress consort in 1724. There was also Peter Alexeyevich, the young son of the dead Tsarevich Alexei, and therefore Peter's grandson. Different factions saw different futures. The old aristocracy could look toward the grandson. Men who had risen under Peter feared what a restoration around Alexei's line might mean for them. Alexander Menshikov, Peter's brilliant, corrupt, indispensable favorite, had everything to lose if power passed to enemies. The Guards regiments had everything to gain by deciding who wore the crown. Peter lay dying. Tradition says that he attempted to write a final instruction beginning with words equivalent to "give everything to." Then he could write no more. The story is famous, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain. No name completed the sentence. On February 8th, 1725 by the Gregorian calendar, corresponding to January 28th in the Russian Julian calendar then in use, Peter the Great died. He was 52. The empire did not collapse. That was perhaps his greatest institutional victory. Government offices continued functioning. Regiments remained armed. Taxes were collected. Ships remained in harbor. St. Petersburg remained the capital. Russia remained a great power. But Peter had transformed the monarchy without solving how monarchy itself should transfer power. Within hours of his death, rival factions maneuvered. The question was no longer whether Peter's reforms had changed Russia. They had. The question was who controlled the machinery he left behind. Menshikov moved quickly. The Guards appeared. Their presence changed the argument. Catherine, Peter's widow, had no conventional hereditary claim stronger than the emperor's grandson. But she possessed allies. She possessed visibility at court. Most importantly, she possessed military support. The elite regiments that Peter had nurtured from his childhood games now stood in position to decide the imperial succession. The age of Peter the Great was over. The age of palace coups was beginning. When Peter the Great died in 1725, the empire he had created was powerful enough to survive him, but the succession system was not. His widow, Catherine I, was placed on the throne with crucial support from Alexander Menshikov and the Guards. Her reign lasted only 2 years. After her death came Peter II, Peter the Great's grandson, then Anna Ivanovna, then the infant Ivan VI. Rulers changed, court factions rose and vanished, and the Guards discovered that soldiers standing outside a palace at the correct moment could decide who possessed an empire. In 1741, Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth seized power in another coup. Her 20-year reign finally brought a measure of stability. She patronized architecture, education, and culture, supported the foundation of Moscow University in 1755, and led Russia into the 7 Years' War against Frederick the Great's Prussia. Russian troops fought their way into Berlin, and Prussia approached disaster. Then Elizabeth died in January 1762. Her successor, Peter III, admired Frederick and rapidly withdrew Russia from the war. His policies, personality, and contempt for established court expectations alienated powerful groups almost immediately. 6 months after becoming emperor, Peter was overthrown. The person replacing him was his own wife. She had been born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess. History remembers her as Catherine the Great. Catherine too seized power in 1762 without an unquestionable hereditary right to the Russian throne. That insecurity never disappeared entirely, and it helps explain the extraordinary energy of her reign. She cultivated the nobility, corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers, collected art, promoted education, and attempted to present herself as a rational European sovereign. Her nakaz, or instruction, drew upon Montesquieu and Beccaria and discussed law in the language of the Enlightenment. Yet Catherine remained an autocrat ruling a society in which millions of peasants lived under serfdom. That contradiction defined her age. Russia became more European at its court, while the power of many landlords over their peasants remained enormous. And when rebellion threatened that order, Catherine defended it without hesitation. The greatest challenge came from Milian Pugachev, a Don Cossack who claimed that Peter III had somehow survived and that he was the true emperor. Beginning in 1773, his rebellion spread across the Volga and Ural regions. Cossacks, peasants, industrial workers, Bashkirs, and other dissatisfied groups joined. Estates burned. Landowners were killed. Government authority disappeared across large areas. The rebellion demonstrated how much anger existed beneath imperial grandeur. The army eventually crushed it. Pugachev was brought to Moscow and executed in 1775. Catherine emerged more cautious about changing the social structure on which noble loyalty depended. Beyond Russia's borders, however, she was relentless. Wars against the Ottoman Empire pushed Russian influence toward the Black Sea. The Treaty of Kukut-Kainarka in 1774 produced major strategic gains. In 1783, Catherine annexed Crimea, ending the independent existence of the Crimean Khanate. Sevastopol developed into a central base for the Black Sea Fleet. To the west, Russia joined Prussia and Austria in the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1772, 1793, and 1795, the Commonwealth was progressively divided until it disappeared as an independent state. Millions of Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, and others now lived under Russian imperial rule. Russia's strength had become undeniable. So had the challenge of governing an empire whose subjects followed different religions, spoke different languages, and remembered different political traditions. When Catherine died in 1796, her son Paul I inherited this enormous structure. Paul distrusted much of what his mother represented. He imposed severe military discipline, curtailed some noble privileges, and attempted to impose order on a court accustomed to influence. His most lasting decision was the succession law of 1797, designed to prevent another century of uncertainty over the throne. But Paul's behavior alienated powerful officers and nobles. In March 1801, conspirators entered his palace and murdered him. His son Alexander I became emperor under the shadow of his father's death. Alexander initially dreamed of reform. He discussed administrative modernization and entertained constitutional ideas. Yet Europe gave him little time. Napoleon Bonaparte was transforming the continent. Russia joined coalitions against France, and in 1805 Alexander experienced Napoleon's military genius at Austerlitz, where the combined Russian and Austrian army suffered a devastating defeat. 2 years later, another defeat at Friedland forced Alexander to negotiate. Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft on the Niemen River at Tilsit. For a time, they appeared to divide influence between themselves. The arrangement could not last. Russia suffered economically under Napoleon's continental system. Tensions over Poland and European influence deepened. In June 1812, Napoleon crossed into the Russian Empire with the enormous multinational Grande Army. Rather than give him the immediate decisive victory he wanted, Russian armies retreated. Supplies disappeared ahead of the invaders. Distances lengthened. Disease and hunger weakened Napoleon's force. At Borodino in September, the armies finally collided in one of the bloodiest battles of the age. The French held the battlefield. The Russian army survived. Then Moscow was abandoned. Napoleon entered the old capital and found no surrender waiting for him. Fires devastated much of the city. Alexander refused to make peace. Napoleon had reached Moscow, yet possessed no political victory. With winter approaching and supplies collapsing, he retreated. The retreat became catastrophe. Cold was only one killer among many. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, desertion, Russian attacks, and the destruction of logistical support reduced the Grande Army to a fraction of the force that had crossed the frontier. Russia then carried the war west. In 1814, Russian troops entered Paris. A state once dismissed as a distant Eastern power now helped decide the political future of Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, Alexander stood among the victorious architects of the post-Napoleonic order. But Russian officers returning from Europe brought home dangerous questions. They had fought to liberate Europe from Napoleon. Why did millions of Russians remain serfs? They had seen constitutional governments and public political life. Why should Russia remain an unlimited autocracy? When Alexander died in 1825, confusion over the succession created an opportunity. On Senate Square in St. Petersburg, reform-minded officers attempted an uprising later known as the Decembrist Revolt. They demanded political change, though the conspirators themselves disagreed over exactly what Russia should become. Nicholas I crushed them. 5 leaders were executed. Others went to Siberia. The new emperor never forgot the morning on which his reign had nearly begun with revolution. Nicholas built his political vision around orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Censorship tightened. The third section monitored opposition. Polish rebellion was crushed. Russia intervened against revolution abroad and acquired a reputation as the defender of Europe's conservative order. Yet the empire's appearance of strength concealed technological and economic weakness. Serfdom persisted. Industrialization lagged behind Britain and parts of Western Europe. Transportation across Russia's enormous distances remained inadequate. Then the Crimean War exposed everything. Beginning in 1853, Russia confronted the Ottoman Empire and then Britain, France, and Sardinia. At Sevastopol, Russian defenders fought with extraordinary endurance. But courage could not compensate fully for obsolete logistics, inadequate infrastructure, and the industrial superiority of Russia's opponents. Nicholas died in 1855 before the war ended. His son Alexander II inherited defeat. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 damaged Russian prestige and restricted its Black Sea position. Alexander understood the warning. The empire had to change. In 1861, he emancipated the serfs. More than 20 million privately owned serfs gained personal freedom. It was one of the greatest social transformations in 19th century Europe. But emancipation did not simply hand peasants the land they wanted. Land settlements, communal arrangements, and redemption payments generated new grievances. Freedom arrived entangled in debt and bureaucracy. Alexander nevertheless continued reform. Zemstvo institutions expanded local government. The judiciary was modernized. Public trials and professional lawyers transformed legal culture. Military service was reorganized. Universities and public discussion experienced periods of greater openness. Railways expanded. Russia was changing faster than under Nicholas. Yet reform created expectations it could not satisfy. Some wanted constitutional government. Peasants wanted more land. Poles demanded national freedom and rebelled in 1863. Radical intellectuals increasingly concluded that autocracy could not reform itself enough. Revolutionary organizations emerged. On March 13, 1881, members of Narodnaya Volia, the People's Will, attacked Alexander's carriage in St. Petersburg. The first bomb did not kill him. Alexander left the damaged carriage. A second attacker threw another bomb at close range. The emperor who had freed the serfs was mortally wounded and died that day. His son, Alexander III, drew the opposite lesson from the one his father had drawn after Crimea. Reform, he believed, had encouraged disorder. Autocracy had to be strengthened. Political controls tightened. Russification intensified in parts of the empire. Jewish subjects faced discriminatory restrictions, while devastating pogroms in the early 1880s drove many families to emigrate. Yet Alexander III Russia also industrialized. Railways expanded. Factories multiplied. And in 1891, construction began on the Trans-Siberian Railway, an undertaking intended to bind European Russia to its immense Asian territories. By the time Alexander died in 1894, the empire looked formidable. His son Nicholas II inherited its unresolved contradictions. Nicholas believed deeply in autocracy, but the society beneath him was becoming impossible to govern, as though the 18th century had never ended. Industrial workers crowded into rapidly growing cities. Peasant hunger for land remained unresolved. Liberals demanded representation. Socialists organized clandestinely. National movements challenged imperial centralization. And Russia's ambitions in East Asia brought it into conflict with Japan. The Russo-Japanese War began in 1904. The government expected victory. Instead came humiliation. Port Arthur fell. Russian armies lost major battles. Then the Baltic Fleet, after sailing halfway around the world, encountered the Japanese fleet at Tsushima in May 1905. It was annihilated. Military defeat collided with domestic anger. On January 22, 1905, peaceful demonstrators led by the priest Georgy Gapon marched toward the Winter Palace carrying petitions. Nicholas was not there. Troops fired upon crowds in what became known as Bloody Sunday. The precise casualty numbers remained disputed, but the political damage was immense. The paternal image of the Tsar suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. Strikes spread. Peasants attacked estates. National unrest intensified. Sailors mutinied aboard the battleship Potemkin. Workers organized councils called Soviets. Nicholas finally issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and an elected legislature, the Duma. Russia appeared to be moving toward constitutional monarchy. But Nicholas never accepted parliamentary government wholeheartedly. He retained enormous powers. Early Dumas were dissolved when it challenged the government. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin combined repression with ambitious agricultural reform, hoping to create prosperous, independent peasants with a stake in stability. Some reforms produced results. Russia's economy grew rapidly before 1914, but time was running out. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911. 3 years later, Europe went to war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered the alliance crisis of 1914. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia and against Austria-Hungary. Germany declared war on Russia. At first, patriotic crowds filled the streets. St. Petersburg's German sounding name was changed to Petrograd. Few understood what industrialized war would demand. Russian armies suffered enormous losses. They also achieved victories, particularly against Austria-Hungary, but the human and material burden became unbearable. Millions were killed, wounded, or captured. Railways struggled to move soldiers, weapons, fuel, and food simultaneously. Inflation eroded wages. Cities faced shortages. Political confidence collapsed. In 1915, Nicholas made the disastrous political decision to assume personal supreme command of the army. From then on, military failures attached themselves directly to the emperor. Petrograd was left increasingly associated with Empress Alexandra and the controversial influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian holy man whose apparent ability to calm the suffering of the hemophiliac heir Alexei gave him remarkable access to the imperial family. Rumors surrounding Rasputin became poisonous. He was murdered by aristocratic conspirators in December 1916. Killing him solved nothing. By February 1917, Petrograd was combustible. Food shortages brought women into the streets. Workers joined them. Demonstrations expanded. The government ordered troops to restore order. Many soldiers refused. Some killed their officers and joined the crowds. The regime discovered the final truth of autocratic power. An emperor could issue any command he wished, but authority ceased to exist once armed men stopped obeying. The Duma established a provisional committee. Workers and soldiers organized the Petrograd Soviet. Nicholas attempted to return to the capital and found the railway system itself slipping from his control. His generals concluded that abdication was necessary. On March 15th, 1917 by the Gregorian calendar, Nicholas II abdicated. More than 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended with a signature. The Russian Empire had fallen. No foreign army had captured Petrograd. No enemy emperor had seized the throne. The structure had collapsed under the combined pressure of war, social inequality, political paralysis, nationalism, economic disruption, and a monarchy incapable of adapting quickly enough. For several months, Russia attempted something different. The provisional government promised political freedom and elections, but it made the fatal decision to continue the war. Peasants wanted land immediately. Soldiers wanted peace. Workers demanded food and control over conditions. National movements wanted autonomy or independence. The government offered procedure when millions demanded solutions. Into this crisis returned Vladimir Lenin. Germany facilitated his journey from exile, hoping his revolutionary politics would weaken Russia's war effort. Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917 and demanded an end to cooperation with the provisional government. Peace, land, bread, all power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks initially remained a minority, but events radicalized the population. A failed military offensive deepened chaos. The July days shook Petrograd. Then General Lavr Kornilov appeared to threaten the revolution by moving forces toward the capital. The government relied partly on socialist organizations, including Bolsheviks, to mobilize resistance. Kornilov's effort collapsed. The Bolsheviks emerged stronger. In November 1917 by the modern calendar, corresponding to October under the old Russian calendar, Bolshevik forces seized key points in Petrograd and overthrew the provisional government. The Winter Palace fell. Lenin announced a new government. But taking a capital was easier than ruling the former empire. Civil war followed. The Bolshevik Red Army confronted white armies ranging from monarchists to conservatives and anti-Bolshevik Republicans. National movements fought for independence. Foreign powers intervened. Peasant armies defended local interests. Violence came from multiple sides. The Bolsheviks established the Chayka and unleashed the Red Terror. White forces committed massacres and pogroms of their own. War communism requisitioned grain and tightened state control. Famine and disease killed on an enormous scale. In July 1918, Nicholas II, Alexandra, their 5 children, and several attendants were executed by Bolshevik authorities in Ekaterinburg. The Romanov dynasty was not merely deposed. Its immediate imperial family was physically eliminated. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had defeated the principal white forces. The former empire had fragmented, and Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania secured independence, while other territories were reconquered or incorporated into Soviet republics. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was created. The Russian Empire was gone. But geography has a long memory. Moscow was again the center of a vast multinational state. Central authority again governed enormous territories from Eastern Europe into the Pacific. Security along distant frontiers remained an obsession. The political ideology was completely different, but some structural problems survived the revolution that claimed to have destroyed the old world. After Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin eventually defeated his rivals and consolidated extraordinary personal power. Forced collectivization transformed agriculture at terrible human cost. The famine of 1932 to 1933 killed millions across several Soviet regions, with Ukraine suffering catastrophically in the famine known as the Holodomor. Rapid industrialization built factories, mines, dams, and military industries on a colossal scale. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 consumed communist officials, officers, intellectuals, workers, peasants, and countless others. Executions and gulag imprisonment spread fear across the Soviet Union. The monarchy had vanished. Political repression had not. Then history brought an invasion greater than Napoleon's. After signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939 and participating in the partition of Poland while annexing or occupying additional Western territories, Stalin's government discovered the limits of that arrangement on June 22, 1941. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. German forces invaded the Soviet Union on an enormous front. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured during the first months. Cities fell. Entire populations faced occupation, starvation, mass shootings, and genocidal policies. The war became a struggle for survival. The Soviet state moved factories east. Men and women entered military production. The Red Army recovered from catastrophic defeats at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and across thousands of lesser-known battlefields. The tide eventually turned. The human cost was staggering. The Soviet Union lost roughly 27 million people, military and civilian, though estimates and categories vary. In 1945, Soviet soldiers entered Berlin. Once again, as in 1814, an invading army had crossed deep into Russian-controlled territory only to be driven all the way back to the enemy's capital. But the country that emerged victorious was no longer the empire of Alexander I. The double-headed eagle had disappeared. The Orthodox Tsar had disappeared. The nobility had disappeared as a ruling estate. The old imperial army had disappeared. Yet the state centered on Moscow commanded territories stretching across Eurasia and possessed influence farther into Europe than the Romanovs had ever achieved. That is where the long story reveals its deepest continuity and its deepest break. The Russian Empire was never inevitable. It was constructed over centuries. It grew from river networks and competing medieval principalities. It survived Mongol domination. Moscow defeated rivals that once seemed stronger. Its princes transformed themselves into tsars. Its tsars transformed their realm into an empire. That empire crossed Siberia, reached the Pacific, conquered peoples of the steppe and Caucasus, fought Ottomans, Swedes, Poles, Persians, Frenchmen, Japanese, and Germans, and became one of the decisive powers in world affairs. But every stage of expansion produced new obligations. A larger army required greater taxation. Greater taxation required stronger administration. Stronger administration increased pressure on society. Imperial diversity created both enormous cultural richness and recurring struggles over autonomy and identity. Modernization strengthened the state while creating educated elites and industrial workers capable of challenging it. Serfdom helped sustain the old order until it became one of the greatest obstacles to that order's survival. Reform arrived, but repeatedly stopped before the principle of autocracy itself. By 1917, war demanded more than that political structure could provide. The Romanovs fell, yet 1917 did not erase 1,000 years and begin history again. Nothing could. The Soviet Union inherited cities, borders, strategic fears, populations, economic networks, and administrative habits shaped by the states that preceded it. At the same time, it transformed society so violently that calling it merely the Russian Empire under another name would be deeply misleading. The Bolsheviks destroyed monarchy, aristocratic privilege, and the old legal order. They created a radically different ideology and economic system. Continuity and revolution existed together. And this is why the story cannot truly be understood by starting with Peter the Great, or Catherine, or Nicholas II. Its roots reach back to boats moving through forest rivers before Russia possessed its name. They reach back to Kiev and the baptism under Vladimir, to the destruction brought by Bata Khan, to Moscow's princes carrying tribute to the horde before their descendants defied it, to Ivan III standing independent on the other side of the Ugra, to Ivan IV claiming the title of Tsar, to a country nearly disappearing during the time of troubles, to the Romanovs rebuilding it, to Cossacks and merchants pushing across Siberia until the continent ran out and the Pacific appeared before them, to Peter constructing a capital in Baltic marshes because he believed geography itself could be challenged by imperial will. And ultimately, to millions of ordinary people whose names rarely entered chronicles at all. Peasants planting fields while armies marched past. Soldiers disappearing into wars fought thousands of kilometers from home. Workers laying railway tracks across Siberia. Indigenous communities confronting an expanding frontier. Merchants carrying goods between civilizations. Old believers fleeing persecution into forests. Serfs waiting generations for freedom. Women standing in bread lines in Petrograd and unknowingly helping begin the final revolution of Imperial Russia. Emperors dominated the portraits, but those people carried the empire. For centuries, the Russian state repeatedly seemed close to destruction. The Mongols burned its cities. Dynastic extinction almost dissolved it. Napoleon occupied Moscow. Revolutionaries killed an emperor. Japan humiliated its military. World War shattered its economy. And in 1917, after surviving enemies from every direction, the empire finally succumbed to the contradictions within itself. The Romanov throne vanished. The imperial banners came down. St. Petersburg became Petrograd, then Leningrad, and decades later, St. Petersburg again. The Soviet Union that replaced the empire would itself rise to superpower status and eventually disappear in 1991. Borders would move once more. Names would change once more. Arguments over the inheritance of Rus, empire, revolution, identity, and territory would continue. But the vanished Russian Empire left a mark too deep to disappear with a dynasty. It reshaped Eurasia. It connected Baltic ports with Pacific harbors under one government. It carried Orthodox traditions into an imperial political identity while ruling enormous Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Catholic, Protestant, and indigenous populations. It produced extraordinary literature, music, science, architecture, and political thought besides censorship, serfdom, conquest, exile, and repression. Its history cannot be reduced either to grandeur or tyranny. It contained both creation and destruction, often at exactly the same moment. And after nearly 1,000 years of princes, khans, grand princes, tsars, emperors, rebels, reformers, soldiers, and revolutionaries, the political world that had begun among the rivers of medieval Rus had changed beyond recognition. The empire was gone. The dynasty was gone. The throne was empty. But the history that created them remained, embedded in the cities, borders, institutions, cultures, memories, and conflicts of the vast Eurasian world they had helped shape.